Hello, and thank you for joining for tonight's story. I hope you enjoy. The Pelt of Plateau. The needle pierced the skin with a sound like wet leather being punctured, and Harold Vance tried not to look at what he was sewing. His workshop in the basement of his Plateau, Alabama home smelled of formaldehyde and pine shavings, of the chemical tang of preservation fluids, and the copper sweetness that no amount of Lysol could ever quite erase. It was November 1972, and the fluorescent tubes above his bench hummed with the desperation of insects that had long since given up trying to escape the light. Harold was 63 years old and had been a taxidermist for 42 of them. He had mounted deer with 12-point racks. He had preserved the corpses of prize-winning Hereford bulls. He had reconstructed the shattered skull of a black bear that had mauled a hunter in the Talladega National Forest. He had seen death in every configuration that the Alabama wilderness could devise, and he had made peace with his work by telling himself that he was giving the dead a second life, a frozen, glass-eyed immortality that would hang over fireplaces and impress dinner guests for generations to come. But he had never sewn a human face onto a wolf's carcass before. The skin lay across his workbench like a discarded garment, and Harold could not stop crying. The tears ran down his weathered cheeks in steady streams, dripping from his chin onto the leather apron that protected his overalls. His hands, steady for 4 decades, steady through the reconstruction of shattered jaws and the delicate wiring of eyelids, were shaking so violently that the curved needle kept slipping from his grip, clattering against the steel tools arranged in neat rows beside the sink. "It's too small," he whispered to the empty basement, his voice cracking like old timber. "Oh God in heaven, it's too small." The face was Mrs. Sterling's. He knew it was Mrs. Sterling's because he had seen her at the Piggly Wiggly every Tuesday for 15 years, buying her special order European cheeses and her organic vegetables with the haughty patience of a woman who had never been told no. Eleanor Sterling had been beautiful in the way that money made people beautiful, her skin perpetually moisturized, her hair a cascade of auburn waves that never frizzed in the Alabama humidity, her smile practiced and precise and utterly empty of genuine warmth. Now her face was in Harold's hands, and it didn't fit. The skin was too small for the wolf's skull beneath it, not by a fraction of an inch, not by a margin that could be disguised with careful stretching or strategic tucking. The human skin was too small by a grotesque, impossible margin, as if it had been stretched over something much larger and more violent than the delicate bone structure of a 52-year-old socialite. The cheeks bulged where they should have hollowed. The eye sockets gaped like open wounds because the skin refused to reach the orbital ridges. The mouth, oh God, the mouth was pulled into a rictus grin that showed teeth that were far too long, far too sharp, far too numerous to belong to any human being. Harold had found the carcass in the sinkhole behind the Sterling estate 3 nights ago. He had gone there because old Mrs. Abernathy had reported seeing something in her backyard, something that walked on 2 legs and then 4, something that had howled with a voice like a woman screaming. The police had laughed her off the phone, but Harold had known the woods behind the Sterling property since he was a boy. He had known where the limestone sinkholes were, where the ground could swallow a man whole without leaving so much as a footprint to mark his passage. He had expected to find a coyote, maybe a feral dog. He had not expected to find a thing that was simultaneously a wolf and a woman, its body broken by a fall into the sinkhole, its upper torso still wearing the tattered remnants of a silk blouse that Harold recognized from the society pages of the Birmingham News. And he had certainly not expected the creature to still be breathing when he found it. The memory made Harold drop the needle again, and this time he didn't pick it up. He pressed his palms against his eyes and sobbed, rocking back and forth on his stool, the metal legs squeaking against the concrete floor in a rhythm that matched his keening grief. He could still hear the sound it had made, not a growl, not a whimper, but a wet, clicking attempt at speech, as if the thing's throat was trying to form words in a language that human vocal cords were never meant to pronounce. "Help me," it had gurgled, and the voice had been Alina Sterling's voice, cultured and precise even as it bubbled through a throat full of blood and fur. "Harold, please." The skin. He hadn't helped her. He had run. He had run all the way home, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his mind screaming at him that what he had seen was impossible, that Alina Sterling was probably at the country club right now, sipping a gin and tonic and complaining about the colored help. But the image of her face, half human, half something else, the skin splitting along the hairline to reveal coarse gray fur beneath, had followed him home like a loyal dog. The next morning, he had returned to the sinkhole with his equipment. The creature was dead by then, its chest still, its eyes, one human brown, one lupin gold, staring up at the Alabama sky with an expression that Harold could only describe as relief. He had taken the body. He had told himself it was for science, for understanding, for the chance to prove to himself that he had imagined the whole terrible encounter in the fevered grip of a sleepless night. But now, with the face in his hands and the needle in his grip, Harold Vance understood that some things were not meant to be understood. Some things were meant only to be feared. He looked down at his workbench and saw that the skin was moving. Not twitching. That would have been bad enough, a post-mortem reflex, a nerve firing its last electrical impulse. No, the skin was moving with purpose, with intention, the edges of the face rippling like water disturbed by an invisible hand. The too small skin was stretching, somehow impossibly, reaching across the expanse of the wolf's skull with a wet, organic sound that reminded Harold of boots pulling free from deep mud. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no, please God, no." The skin latched onto the bone. Harold felt it happen through the tips of his fingers, felt the moment when the flesh found purchase and began to adhere, not with the chemical bond of his preservation fluids, but with something older, something hungrier. The face on his workbench turned toward him, and Alina Sterling's lips, which had been too small for the skull beneath them, spread into a smile that showed teeth that were getting longer by the second. "Thank you, Harold," the thing said, and its voice was not Alina Sterling's voice anymore. It was deeper, richer, threaded with harmonics that made Harold's fillings ache in his molars. "You've given me such a lovely second face." Harold Vance tried to scream, but the thing was already moving, already unfolding from the workbench with the sinuous grace of a predator that had practiced its hunting for centuries. The last thing the old taxidermist saw was his own reflection in the creature's eyes, one human, one lupin, and the reflection was smiling with a mouth that had too many teeth. The last thing he heard was the wet, rhythmic sound of skin being stretched over something much larger than it was ever meant to cover. Then there was only the darkness, and the waiting, and the patient hunger of something that had finally learned how to wear its disguise properly. 51 years later, Nathan Cole sat in a coffee shop in Birmingham, Alabama, and stared at a manila envelope that he wasn't supposed to have. The envelope was unmarked, save for a faded stamp in the upper left corner that read Plateau PD Evidence Division. Do not remove. The coffee shop was one of those aggressively hipster establishments that had sprung up in the revitalized downtown district. All exposed brick and Edison bulbs and baristas with sleeves of tattoos who made pour-over coffee with the solemn concentration of priests performing communion. Nathan didn't care about the coffee. He didn't care about the atmosphere. He cared about what was inside the envelope, which he had spent 3 months and $4,000 of his podcast's Patreon money to obtain from a retired evidence clerk who had emphysema and a gambling problem. Nathan was 34 years old and had the kind of face that people forgot. Average height, average build, brown hair that was already starting to thin at the crown, hazel eyes that seemed to change color depending on the light. He had spent the last 6 years building American Ghost Stories, a true crime podcast that specialized in what he called Forgotten Americana, the cases that had been buried by time, the murders that had been overshadowed by bigger headlines, the disappearances that had been dismissed as runaways or suicides because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. He had covered the Black Dahlia copycat killings in 1950s Ohio. He had investigated the smiley face killer theory along the interstate corridors of the Midwest. He had spent 6 months trying to prove that the Atlanta child murders had been the work of multiple perpetrators, not just Wayne Williams. None of it had prepared him for what he was about to read. The envelope contained the sealed police files from Plateau, Alabama, dated April through May of 1971. The files had never been digitized, never been scanned, never been uploaded to any database. They existed only in this envelope, in the cramped handwriting of detectives who had long since retired or died, in the faded Polaroid photographs that smelled of developing chemicals and old paper. Nathan opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than Harold Vance's had been, but not by much. The first document was an incident report dated April 3, 1971. The responding officer, a Deputy Franklin Hargrove, had been called to the Sterling estate on a report of suspicious animal activity. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling had reported seeing a large dog or possibly wolf in her backyard, and she had expressed concern for her prize-winning roses. The deputy had found nothing except a few disturbed flower beds and a scent that he described in his careful cursive as like a wet dog but wrong somehow, like something that had been dead for a while but was still walking around. Nathan flipped to the next report. April 7, 1971. Another call from the Sterling estate. This time, Mrs. Sterling had reported hearing a woman screaming from the woods behind her property. The deputy had investigated and found nothing. Mrs. Sterling had insisted that the screams had sounded familiar, that they had sounded like her own voice, but the deputy had noted in the margin that Mrs. Sterling was known to be eccentric and possibly intoxicated. April 12, 1971. The reports were escalating now. Multiple sightings across the Sterling property, neighbors reporting howling at night. A local hunter named Cletus Barnes claimed to have seen a woman running on all fours near the old limestone quarry. The deputy had filed this report with a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation of the witness. April 19, 1971. The tone of the reports changed. Deputy Hargrove wrote in hurried, almost illegible script, Sterling estate, possible animal attack. Victim, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, 52. Scene indicates struggle, blood on patio, drag marks leading to woods, large paw prints mixed with what appear to be human footprints, size 7 women's heel. Mrs. Sterling's shoes found near roses, blood-type matches. No body recovered. Search continuing. Nathan's hands were shaking now. He flipped through the remaining pages, his eyes scanning the increasingly frantic handwriting of a police department that was rapidly losing its grip on a case that refused to make sense. April 22, 1971. Cletus Barnes found dead in his hunting blind. Cause of death, exsanguination. The deputy's report noted that the victim's throat appeared to have been torn by an animal of considerable size, but the angle of the wound suggests the attacker was standing upright at the time of the strike. April 25, 1971. The Abernathy family reported a large animal in their backyard. Their daughter, 12-year-old Sarah, claimed to have seen a lady with a wolf's body looking through her bedroom window. The deputy had found scratches on the exterior wall, 12 feet above the ground. April 28, 1971. 3 more deaths, 2 hunters, 1 hiker, all found in the woods near the Sterling estate, all killed by exsanguination. All showed signs of having been stalked for miles before the final attack, based on the pattern of footprints found at the scenes. April 30, 1971. The final report in the file. Deputy Hargrove had written it in a hand that was barely recognizable as his own, the letters shaky and oversized, as if written by a child or a man in the grip of profound terror. Sterling estate has been searched top to bottom, found basement laboratory, medical equipment unknown origin, surgical tables, refrigeration units containing biological material, multiple wolf carcasses in various states of dissection, human tissue samples. Records indicate involvement of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, a subsidiary of Sterling Holdings. Recommend immediate contact with state authorities and federal investigators. Recommend quarantine of entire property. Recommend. The report ended mid-sentence. The remaining pages were blank except for a single note, written in a different hand, dated May 15, 1971. Case closed. No further investigation warranted. All evidence to be sealed by order of Judge Robert Sterling. Nathan sat back in his chair, his coffee forgotten and cold, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just read. Robert Sterling was Eleanor Sterling's husband. Robert Sterling was also the senior circuit judge for the district that included Plateau. Robert Sterling had closed the investigation into his wife's disappearance and the subsequent deaths of 7 people. Robert Sterling had buried the evidence and threatened the witnesses and made the entire nightmare disappear beneath a blanket of judicial authority and pharmaceutical money. And Robert Sterling had done it, Nathan realized, because he had known exactly what was killing people in the woods behind his wife's estate. He had known because his wife's estate had been the birthplace of the monster. Nathan gathered the files with trembling hands and slipped them back into the envelope. He had come to Plateau chasing a story about a cryptid, about the wolf woman that had become a local legend in the decades since the 1971 killings. He had expected to find a case of mass hysteria, of mistaken identity, of a feral dog or an escaped exotic pet that had been embellished by time and folklore until it had become something supernatural. He had not expected to find evidence of a conspiracy. He had not expected to find medical laboratories and pharmaceutical subsidiaries and judicial cover-ups. He had not expected to find a truth that was somehow worse than any legend. Because the witness reports, Nathan had read them before, in secondary sources, in the ghost story websites and the cryptid forums that had first drawn his attention to the wolf woman legend. But those reports had been sanitized, simplified, stripped of their most disturbing details by decades of retelling. The original reports, the ones in Nathan's hands, contained a detail that no secondary source had ever mentioned. The creature didn't just chase people, it didn't just kill them, it mimicked their voices. Multiple witnesses reported hearing the voice of Eleanor Sterling calling to them from the woods, pleading for help, asking them to come closer, to follow her into the trees. Cletus Barnes had told the deputy that he had heard his own mother's voice, his mother, who had been dead for 20 years, calling to him from the darkness, asking him to come home, to come to her, to let her hold him one more time. The creature had used their loved ones' voices as bait. It had learned their names, their histories, their deepest vulnerabilities, and it had weaponized them with a precision that spoke not of animal instinct, but of human cunning. Nathan thought of his own mother, dead for 5 years now, cancer that had taken her slowly and cruelly. He thought of her voice, warm and reassuring, the voice that had read him bedtime stories and told him that monsters weren't real, that the darkness held nothing to fear. He thought of that voice calling to him from the woods, and he felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's overactive air conditioning. He needed to go to Plateau. He needed to find the Sterling estate. He needed to understand what had happened in those woods in the spring of 1971, and he needed to understand why the creature, if it had ever been a creature, if it had ever been anything other than a woman's body stretched over a wolf's hunger, had stopped killing so abruptly in May of that year. Because the most disturbing detail of all, the one that had drawn Nathan to this case in the first place, was the sudden cessation of activity. The wolf woman had killed 7 people in 27 days, had terrorized an entire community, had left a trail of blood and fear that should have taken years to fade from collective memory. And then on May 1, 1971, she had simply stopped. No more sightings, no more deaths, no more screams in the night, The creature had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the sealed files and the whispered legends and the occasional drunk who claimed to have seen something in the woods on a moonless night. Nathan needed to know why. He needed to know where she had gone, what had happened to her, whether the thing that had been Eileen Sterling was still out there somewhere, waiting in the dark with her too many teeth and her stolen voices and her patient, predatory silence. He paid for his cold coffee and stepped out into the Birmingham afternoon, the manila envelope clutched against his chest like a shield. The sun was bright, the sky was clear, and Nathan Cole had never felt less safe in his life. Because somewhere in Alabama, in the ruins of an estate that had been swallowed by 50 years of kudzu and neglect, something was waiting, something that had learned to wear a woman's face, something that had learned to speak with a woman's voice, something that had been very, very hungry for a very, very long time. And Nathan was about to walk straight into its den. Port City, Alabama, was not a city at all, but a town of 4,000 souls that had been clinging to the edge of the mobile Tenso River Delta since before the Civil War. Its downtown consisted of 3 blocks of brick buildings that had once been grand and were now merely old, their facades crumbling in the humid embrace of the Alabama climate, their windows filled with the dusty displays of antique shops and bail bondsmen and convenience stores that sold lottery tickets and shrimp-flavored crackers. Nathan arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the humidity had begun to relent but the mosquitoes had not, and the air smelled of rotting vegetation and distant industry. He checked into a motel called the Delta Breeze that advertised color TV and HBO on a plastic sign that had faded to the point of illegibility, and he spent the first evening organizing his notes and trying to convince himself that the trip was not a mistake. The next morning, he drove to Clara Whitfield's house. Clara was 87 years old and had outlived 2 husbands, 3 children, and the town of Plateau as it had existed in 1971. She lived in a wooden bungalow on the edge of Port City, surrounded by azalea bushes that had grown wild and unkempt, their branches tapping against the windows in the breeze like skeletal fingers asking to be let inside. The porch sagged, the paint peeled, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it had been pushed by a wind that never stopped blowing. Nathan knocked on the door and waited. He heard the shuffle of slippers on hardwood, the rattling of multiple locks being disengaged, and then the door opened a crack to reveal a single watery blue eye. "You're the podcaster," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Nathan Cole," we spoke on the phone. The eye studied him for a long moment, taking in his rental car parked at the curb, his clean jeans and button-down shirt, the digital recorder in his hand. "You don't look like a podcaster," she said finally. "You look like a man who's about to make a mistake he'll spend the rest of his life regretting." Nathan didn't know how to respond to that. "May I come in, Mrs. Whitfield?" The door opened wider. "It's Miss Whitfield. I never married. And you can come in, but I'm warning you now. I don't take my medication until noon, and by then I'll be too confused to remember what I told you. So if you want the truth, you'd better ask your questions while I'm still sharp enough to be scared." The interior of the house smelled of old paper and lavender sachets and something else, something underneath the surface smells that Nathan couldn't quite identify. It was organic, he decided, earthy, like the inside of a greenhouse or the hollow beneath a rotten log. Clara led him through a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs, black and white portraits of stern-faced ancestors, color snapshots of children who were now middle-aged, graduation photos and wedding photos, and funeral programs that had been preserved under glass like pressed flowers. They reached a sitting room that had probably been elegant once, in the way that southern sitting rooms were meant to be elegant, with velvet furniture and lace doilies, and a china cabinet filled with porcelain figurines that had never been touched by human hands. Now the velvet was worn threadbare, the lace was yellowed with age, and the figurine stared out through dusty glass with painted eyes that seemed to follow Nathan as he crossed the room. Clara settled into a wingback chair that had molded itself to her shape over decades of use, and she gestured for Nathan to sit on a sofa that smelled of mothballs and old cat. A tabby regarded him from the windowsill with the suspicious indifference of cats everywhere, its tail twitching in slow, hypnotic arcs. "You want to know about the wolf woman," Clara said. "Everybody who comes here wants to know about the wolf woman. You're not the first and you won't be the last, but you're the first one who brought the sealed files." Nathan started. "How did you?" "I can smell the formaldehyde on the paper from here. They used to preserve evidence in those days. Dunk it in chemicals, seal it in bags, pretend it would stay fresh forever. Nothing stays fresh forever, Mr. Cole. Everything rots eventually. Even memories, especially memories." Nathan pulled the envelope from his bag. "Miss Whitfield, the official records say that the wolf woman was an animal attack, a rogue wolf or a feral dog. The investigation was closed, the case was sealed, and the public was told that the danger had passed. But you were there. You saw something that didn't make it into the newspapers." Clara's watery eyes fixed on him with an intensity that belied her age. "The newspapers," she said slowly, "told a story about a mad dog that had to be put down. They said Mrs. Sterling had been killed by a rabid wolf, and that the animal had been hunted and destroyed by a posse of brave local men. They said the other deaths were accidents, coincidences, unrelated tragedies that happened to occur at the same time." "And you know that's not true," Nathan prompted. "I know," Clara said, "that what I saw was not a wolf, and I know that what I saw was not Mrs. Sterling after she had been killed by a wolf. What I saw was Mrs. Sterling in the process of becoming something else entirely." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, where the azalea branches tapped against the glass in the rising wind. "It was April 15th, 1971. I was 42 years old and I worked as a maid for the Sterling family. I cleaned their house, I cooked their meals. I pretended not to notice when Judge Sterling brought his mistresses home while his wife was at her charity luncheons. I knew the Sterlings better than anyone in Plateau, Mr. Cole. I knew their secrets. I knew their sins. And I knew that Mrs. Sterling had been sick for months before the disappearances started." "Sick how?" "Sick in a way that didn't have a name. She was losing weight, not in a healthy way, not like she was dieting, but like something was eating her from the inside. Her skin became pale, almost translucent. You could see the veins beneath it, blue and branching like rivers on a map. And she was hungry, always hungry. I would find her in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, eating raw meat from the refrigerator with her bare hands, her chin dripping with blood, her eyes," Clara shuddered, a full-body tremor that rattled her fragile frame. "Her eyes were wrong, Mr. Cole. They were yellow around the edges like old paper, and the pupils, they weren't round anymore. They were vertical, like a cat's, or a snake's." Nathan felt his skin prickle. "Did you tell anyone?" "I told Mrs. Abernathy," Clara said. "She was the cook. She'd seen the same things. We thought maybe Mrs. Sterling had caught something from one of the animals. The judge kept hunting dogs, and he was always bringing home strange things from his trips. Foreign birds in cages, lizards in terrariums. We thought maybe she'd been bitten or infected or—" She shook her head. "We didn't know what to think. We just knew we were scared." "What happened on April 15th? Clara was silent for a long moment, her hands worrying at the worn velvet of her chair arms. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to a whisper, as if she were afraid of being overheard by the dusty figurines in their cabinet. "I had gone to the Sterling estate early that morning. The judge was in Montgomery on business, and Mrs. Sterling had asked me to help her prepare for a garden party. I arrived at 6:30 before the sun was fully up, and I found her in the rose garden. She was standing perfectly still, facing the woods, and she was—" Clara's voice broke. "She was naked, Mr. Cole, standing in the dew with nothing on, her skin pale as marble in the dawn light, and her back was to me." Nathan leaned forward, his recorder forgotten in his lap. What did you do? I should have called out to her. I should have asked if she was all right. But something in the way she was standing, so still, so rigid, like a statue that had been placed there by some impossible hand, something made me stay quiet. I watched her from the kitchen window and I waited. For what? For her to move, for her to show that she was human, for something to happen that would make sense. Clara's eyes were dry now, but her voice was thick with tears that had been cried decades ago. And then something did happen, Mr. Cole. Something that I have never been able to explain, not to the police, not to the psychiatrists they sent me to, not to the priests I confessed to in the years since. Something that proved to me, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the world is not the safe and ordered place we pretend it to be. What did you see, Miss Whitfield? I saw her skin split, Clara whispered. I saw it happen slowly, like a seam unraveling, like a zipper being pulled down from the inside. The skin of her back, that perfect, pale skin that she had moisturized and protected and worshipped for 52 years, it opened. It opened along her spine, Mr. Cole, and something began to push its way out. Nathan felt his stomach clench. What was it? Fur, Clara said. Gray fur, coarse and wet with something that wasn't blood but wasn't anything else I could name. It pushed through the opening in her skin like a birth, like something being born from a womb that was never meant to carry it. And Mrs. Sterling, she didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She stood there with her arms spread wide, her face tilted back toward the sky, and she made a sound that was. Clara stopped. Her face had gone pale, her lips bloodless, her hands gripping the chair arms with white-knuckled intensity. What sound did she make, Miss Whitfield? She laughed, Mr. Cole. She laughed while her skin tore itself apart. She laughed while the fur pushed through her flesh. She laughed while her fingers lengthened and her nails became claws and her jaw, oh God, her jaw, it unhinged, Mr. Cole. It unhinged like a snake's, stretching wide enough to show teeth that were too long, too sharp, too many. And the last thing I saw before I ran, the last human thing I saw was her eyes rolling back in her head, and when they rolled forward again they were gold. Pure, lupin gold. Nathan realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for his recorder and made sure it was still running. You ran, he said. I ran, Clara agreed. I ran through the garden, through the kitchen, out to my car in the driveway. I drove all the way to my sister's house in Mobile, and I didn't come back to Plateau for 6 months. By then, Mrs. Sterling was dead, or whatever passes for dead when a person's body transforms into something that shouldn't exist. The other deaths had happened. The case had been closed. And I was told in no uncertain terms that if I ever spoke of what I had seen, I would be prosecuted for perjury, for slander, for any crime that Judge Sterling could think of to silence me. But you spoke to me, Nathan said. Clara's laugh was bitter and short. I'm 87 years old, Mr. Cole. What are they going to do to me now? Take away my social security? Put me in prison? I'm already in prison, a prison of memory, of images that I can't forget, of sounds that I still hear in my dreams. Every night for 51 years, I have watched that woman's skin split open in my sleep. Every night I have heard that laugh. And every night I have wondered when it will be my turn. Your turn for what? To become the thing that she became. Clara's eyes met his, and in their watery blue depths Nathan saw a fear that was older than time itself. Because she wasn't the first, Mr. Cole, and she wasn't the last. The newspapers called her the Wolf Woman as if she were unique, as if she were some anomaly, some accident of nature. But I have always known, that what happened to Eleanor Sterling was not an accident. It was a design, and designs can be replicated. Nathan felt the chill from the coffee shop return, deeper now, settling in his bones. What do you mean, Miss Whitfield? Clara reached beneath her chair and pulled out a wooden box that Nathan hadn't noticed before. It was old, scarred, its hinges rusted and its lid warped by decades of humidity. She opened it with trembling hands and removed a photograph. She held it out to Nathan, and he took it with fingers that felt numb. The photograph was black and white, slightly blurred, as if taken in a hurry or in poor light. It showed a woman standing in what appeared to be a laboratory or operating room, surrounded by medical equipment that Nathan didn't recognize. The woman was wearing a hospital gown, and her face was turned toward the camera with an expression of such absolute despair that Nathan felt his chest tighten with sympathetic grief. But it was not the woman's face that made Nathan's breath catch in his throat. It was her hands. Her hands, which hung at her sides, were covered in coarse gray fur. Her fingers ended in claws that curled inward, scraping against her thighs with a posture that was unmistakably predatory. And beneath the hospital gown, at the point where her torso met her hips, something was wrong. Something bulged and distorted. Something that suggested a skeletal structure that had been twisted and reformed into angles that no human spine should ever achieve. This, Clara said, was taken in March of 1971, 1 month before I saw Mrs. Sterling's transformation. This woman is not Eleanor Sterling. This woman is someone else entirely, someone who was part of the same experiment, the same process, the same abomination. Nathan stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Who is she? Her name, Clara said, was Margaret Holt. She was a seamstress from Birmingham who had volunteered for a medical trial at Sterling Pharmaceuticals. She had been promised treatment for a degenerative nerve condition. Instead, she had been injected with something that changed her. Something that grew inside her, consuming her humanity cell by cell, organ by organ, until there was nothing left but the hunger and the fur and the terrible, beautiful violence of the wolf. Sterling Pharmaceuticals, Nathan repeated. The same company that was mentioned in the police files. The same company that funded the laboratory in the Sterling estate basement. The same company that employed a team of doctors and surgeons and geneticists who were trying to create. Clara paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that was barely audible above the tapping of the azalea branches. They were trying to create a hybrid, Mr. Cole, a creature that combined the intelligence and cunning of a human being with the strength and ferocity of a wolf. A biological weapon, perhaps, or a scientific curiosity, or something far worse than either. They called it Project Cannies, and Margaret Holt was their first successful test subject. Successful. She survived the transformation, Clara said. For a time, but the creature that emerged from her body, it was not Margaret Holt anymore. It was something that wore her face like a mask, that spoke with her voice like a recording, that hunted with the patience of a human mind and the savagery of a predatory instinct. It killed 3 people before they managed to contain it. And then they tried again with Mrs. Sterling, using what they had learned from their mistakes. Nathan's mind was reeling. They deliberately did this to Eleanor Sterling. Judge Sterling approved the project, Clara said. He signed the papers, he funded the research, he recruited the subjects, and when his wife began to show symptoms of the same degenerative condition that had affected Margaret Holt, or so he claimed, he authorized the same treatment. He authorized the transformation of his own wife into a monster. Why? Because he wanted to see if it could be controlled, Clara said. The first subject, Margaret, had been uncontrollable, a wild thing that killed indiscriminately. But Mrs. Sterling was intelligent, educated, disciplined. They thought that if they used the right subject, the transformation might result in something that could be directed, that could be trained, that could be used. Used for what? For whatever the judge wanted. Clara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she had spent so many years being horrified that she had finally reached a state beyond horror. Assassination, intimidation, the elimination of enemies, a creature that looked human enough to approach its target but strong enough to tear out a throat with a single bite, a creature that could mimic voices, that could lure victims with the sounds of their loved ones, a perfect predator hiding behind a perfect disguise. Nathan looked down at the photograph again, at Margaret Holt's despairing face and her clawed, furred hands. He thought of the taxidermist from the opening files, sewing a human face onto a wolf's carcass. He thought of the reports of the creature mimicking voices, calling to its victims from the darkness with the sounds of their mothers and wives and children. And he thought of Eleanor Sterling, standing in her rose garden in the dawn light, laughing while her skin split open to reveal the monster beneath. "What happened to Margaret Holt?" he asked, "after she transformed?" Clara's face twisted with an expression that might have been grief or might have been satisfaction. "They killed her, Mr. Cole. Not with bullets. Bullets didn't work, not on something that healed as fast as she did. They killed her with fire. Burned her alive in a pit behind the laboratory, while she screamed in Margaret's voice and begged for mercy in words that no wolf should have known. They recorded the burning, Mr. Cole. They studied it. They learned from it. And when they transformed Mrs. Sterling, they thought they had improved the design enough to avoid the same fate. But they hadn't." "No," Clara whispered. "They hadn't, because Eleanor Sterling was smarter than they expected. She was patient. She pretended to be controllable, to be docile, to be the perfect weapon they had designed her to be. And then, one night in April, she escaped. She killed the guards, she destroyed the laboratory, and she ran into the woods. And for 27 days she hunted, not because she was a mindless animal, Mr. Cole, but because she was a woman who had been betrayed by her husband, violated by her doctors, and transformed into something that the world would never accept. She hunted because she was angry, and because she was very, very hungry." Nathan sat in silence for a long time, the photograph heavy in his hands, the weight of Clara's words pressing down on him like physical force. Outside, the azalea branches tapped against the window in a rhythm that was starting to sound less like wind and more like code, like some message being transmitted from the darkness beyond the glass. "The records say the killing stopped on May 1st, he said finally. "What happened?" Clara's face went pale again, and this time the pallor was accompanied by a trembling that spread from her hands to her shoulders to her jaw. "I don't know," she said. "Not for certain, but I have heard things over the years, whispers from the families of the dead, rumors from the police officers who were there. They say that the creature didn't die, that it couldn't be killed, not with fire, not with bullets, not with anything the judge could devise. They say that it learned to hide, to burrow, to become something that lived in the spaces between walls, in the crawl spaces beneath houses, in the dark corners where no one ever thought to look. And the judge? Judge Sterling died in 1989, Clara said. Heart attack officially. But my cousin's husband worked as an orderly at the hospital, and he said the judge's body was found with scratches on his throat, deep scratches, like the marks of claws, and his eyes were open, and his mouth was frozen in an expression of such absolute terror that the nurses had to cover his face with a sheet before they could move him to the morgue. Nathan felt his mouth go dry. "You think Eleanor Sterling killed him?" "I think," Clara said, "that the wolf woman has a very long memory, and I think that she has been waiting, all these years, for someone to come along who would dig up the past and give her a reason to hunt again." She leaned forward, her watery eyes fixing on Nathan's with an intensity that was almost physical. "You should go home, Mr. Cole. You should destroy those files, forget this story, and never set foot in Plateau again. Because the wolf woman is not a legend, and she is not a ghost story, and she is not something that died in 1971. She is real. She is patient. And she has been very, very lonely for a very, very long time." Nathan looked down at the photograph of Margaret Holt one last time, at her despairing face and her clawed hands. He thought of Eleanor Sterling's laugh, rising through the dawn like the sound of breaking glass. He thought of the taxidermist's tears, and the skin that was too small, and the teeth that were too many. "I can't go home, Miss Whitfield," he said quietly. "Not yet, not until I know what really happened, not until I understand." "Understanding," Clara whispered, "is overrated. Sometimes the only sane response to horror is to run away and never look back." And sometimes, Nathan said, standing up and tucking the photograph into his bag, the only way to stop the horror is to drag it into the light. Clara watched him leave with eyes that had seen too much and forgot nothing. As he stepped out onto the sagging porch, she called after him in a voice that was barely louder than the wind. "Mr. Cole." He turned. "When you find the den, and you will find it because something is drawing you there, something that has been waiting for someone like you, remember this. The wolf woman's human face is not a deformity. It is a lure. She uses it to make you come closer, to make you trust her, to make you believe, even for a moment, that she is still the person she once was." "I understand," Nathan said. "No," Clara said, "you don't, not yet, but you will. God help you, Mr. Cole, you will." The door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place, and Nathan stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing in the humid Alabama air and trying to convince himself that the fear he felt was just imagination, just the power of suggestion, just the natural response to an old woman's terrifying stories. But when he reached his car, he found a single gray hair caught in the door handle. It was coarse and thick, unlike any human hair he had ever seen, and when he held it up to the light, he could see that the root was still attached, still glistening with something that might have been blood or might have been the organic residue of a creature that had passed this way recently. Very recently. Nathan dropped the hair into the gutter and got into his car, his hands shaking so badly that he had to try 3 times before he could get the key into the ignition. As he pulled away from the curb, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Clara Whitfield standing at her window, watching him go. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the hallway, something tall and pale and impossibly thin was standing very still, its golden eyes reflecting the morning light with a patience that had no end. Nathan blinked, and when he looked again, the hallway was empty. He told himself it had been a trick of the light, a reflection, a shadow cast by the azalea branches. He told himself these things all the way back to the Delta Breeze Motel, and he almost believed them. Almost. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals archives did not exist. At least, that was what Nathan was told by every official source he contacted in the 3 days following his interview with Clara Whitfield. The Alabama Secretary of State had no record of a Sterling Pharmaceuticals Corporation, dissolved or otherwise. The Food and Drug Administration had no files on a Project Canis or any clinical trials conducted in Plateau, Alabama, in the 1970s. The local Chamber of Commerce had never heard of the company. The Historical Society had no documents relating to its operations, and the current residents of Plateau, what few remained, looked at Nathan with expressions ranging from polite confusion to outright hostility when he mentioned the name Sterling. "That family's gone," the elderly proprietor of the Plateau General Store told him when Nathan stopped for gas and a bag of pork rinds on his way back from Port City. "Dead and buried. Nothing left but the old estate, and nobody goes there." "Why not?" The old man's eyes, milky with cataracts but sharp with a lifetime of watching strangers come and go, narrowed at Nathan's tone. "Because it's cursed," he said simply. "Because things happened there that shouldn't have happened, and because the ground over there remembers what the rest of us would rather forget. You do well to leave it alone, son. Some stories are buried for a reason." Nathan thanked him and left, but he didn't leave Plateau. Instead, he checked out of the Delta Breeze and into a camping site on the edge of the National Forest, where he spent his evenings poring over the sealed files by the light of a battery-powered lantern, and his days driving the back roads around the Sterling estate, taking photographs, making notes, trying to piece together a picture of what had happened in the spring of 1971 from the fragments that remained. It was on the 4th day that he found the cemetery. It was hidden in a hollow between 2 hills, accessible only by a dirt track that had been swallowed by kudzu and blackberry brambles. The gate was rusted iron, twisted by decades of neglect, and the sign above it, Sterling Family Memorial Garden, had faded to illegibility. But Nathan recognized the name, and he felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had driven him through 6 years of podcasting, through countless dead ends and false leads and disappointments. He pushed through the gate and entered a world of silence. The cemetery was small, perhaps 50 graves arranged in neat rows beneath the canopy of live oaks that had grown unchecked since the last groundskeeper had abandoned his post. Spanish moss hung from the branches like gray banners, filtering the afternoon light into a greenish twilight that made the headstones glow with an unhealthy luminescence. The grass was knee-high, the paths were invisible, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying flowers and something else, something coppery and organic that reminded Nathan of the formaldehyde on Clara's photographs. He walked between the rows, reading the names and dates. The Sterlings had been buried here for generations, cotton planters and Confederate officers, judges and politicians, the wealthy and powerful who had shaped the destiny of rural Alabama for 2 centuries. The graves were elaborate, ornate, marked by marble angels and granite obelisks and crosses that had been carved by master stonemasons and then left to weather in the humid climate. Nathan found Robert Sterling's grave in the back row, beneath an oak that had grown so large its roots had cracked the marble slab into 3 pieces. The inscription was simple: Robert Harrison Sterling, 1921–1989, beloved husband and father, rest in peace. But someone, Nathan couldn't tell when, had scratched additional words into the stone beneath the official inscription, deep grooves that had been made with something sharp and determined. She is still hungry. Nathan stared at the words for a long time, feeling the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He photographed the inscription, checked his surroundings, and was about to move on when he noticed something that made him freeze. The grave was disturbed. Not dramatically, not dug up, not vandalized, not desecrated in any obvious way. But the earth around the marble slab was slightly raised, slightly swollen, as if something beneath the surface had pushed upward against the weight of the stone. The grass that grew over the grave was a different color than the grass around it, paler, thinner, sickly in a way that suggested the soil beneath was poisoned or barren or contaminated with something that living things couldn't tolerate. And there were tracks. Nathan knelt in the grass, his heart hammering, and studied the impressions in the earth. They were paw prints, large, canine, unmistakable, but they were mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like footprints, but elongated, distorted, as if whatever had made them had been walking on the balls of its feet with the toes curled under, moving with a gait that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The tracks led from Robert Sterling's grave to the edge of the cemetery, where they disappeared into the undergrowth of the surrounding woods. Nathan followed them with his camera, snapping photographs of each impression, measuring them with a folding ruler he carried in his bag. The paw prints were 7 inches long, far larger than any domestic dog and larger even than most wolves. The distorted footprints were size 7 in women's shoes, the same size that had been found at the original crime scenes. Eleanor Sterling's size. Nathan stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the green darkness between the trees, and he felt the weight of Clara's warning pressing down on him like a physical hand. He should go back. He should return to Birmingham, edit his podcast, tell the story as best he could from the files and the interviews and the speculation. He should not follow these tracks into the woods. He should not seek out the thing that had made them. But he was a journalist or something like one, and the story was in the woods. The truth was in the woods, and Nathan had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. He stepped into the trees. The Sterling estate was 2 miles from the cemetery, through a forest that had grown wild and impenetrable in the decades since the property had been abandoned. Nathan followed the tracks as best he could, but they grew fainter as the undergrowth thickened, disappearing in patches of fern and creeping vine that had reclaimed the forest floor. The canopy overhead was dense, filtering the sunlight into a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to tell what time it was or which direction he was facing. He walked for what felt like hours, his clothes snagging on thorns, his face scratched by low-hanging branches, his boots sinking into pockets of mud that smelled of sulfur and rotting vegetation. The woods were silent in a way that was unnatural. No birdsong, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant, rhythmic tapping of something that might have been a woodpecker or might have been the azalea branches against Clara Whitfield's window. It was the silence that should have warned him. The silence that should have told him that he was not alone in these woods, that something had driven away every living thing, that the forest had become a hunting ground where prey learned to be very, very quiet. He found the laboratory in a clearing that he almost didn't see. It was buried beneath a mound of earth and vegetation, visible only as a concrete slab that had cracked under the pressure of roots and time. The entrance, a steel door that had rusted to the color of dried blood, was half open, hanging from twisted hinges that groaned in the faint breeze. Above the door, someone had painted letters that had faded but were still legible. Sterling Pharmaceuticals Research Division, authorized personnel only. Nathan stood at the threshold, his flashlight cutting a beam through the darkness beyond the door, and he felt the first genuine flutter of fear that he had experienced since arriving in Alabama. This was not a legend anymore. This was not a ghost story or a cryptid myth or a case of mass hysteria. This was a real place, a real laboratory, where real people had conducted real experiments that had resulted in real deaths. And the air that drifted from the opening smelled of copper and chemicals, and something else, something that Nathan's hindbrain recognized with a certainty that bypassed conscious thought. It smelled of predator. He stepped through the door. The laboratory had been built into a natural limestone cave, expanded by human hands into a series of rooms and corridors that extended deep into the earth beneath the Sterling estate. The walls were concrete, stained by decades of moisture and mold, and the ceiling was low enough that Nathan had to duck in places to avoid hitting his head on exposed pipes and hanging wires. The first room was an office. Desks lined the walls, their surfaces covered in papers that had yellowed and curled with age. Nathan sifted through them with his flashlight, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes and typed reports and chemical formulas that meant nothing to him, but that sent a chill through his spine nonetheless. Subject MH showing increased lupin characteristics after third injection, skeletal structure adapting to quadrupedal posture, vocal cords displaying anomalous flexibility, recommend accelerated timeline. Subject ES demonstrating unexpected cognitive retention, claims awareness of transformation process, requests termination, request denied by RS. Margaret has escaped containment. She is in the woods. She is calling my name. She sounds exactly like my wife. God help me, she sounds exactly like my wife. The last note was written in a hand that was barely legible, the letters shaky and oversized, as if the writer had been in the grip of profound terror. It was unsigned, but Nathan recognized the initials, R.S. Robert Sterling, the man who had funded this nightmare, who had authorized the transformation of his own wife, who had buried the evidence and silenced the witnesses and died with claw marks on his throat. Nathan moved deeper into the laboratory, following the beam of his flashlight through corridors that grew narrower and damper as he descended. The air grew colder, the smell of copper stronger, and the silence of the woods above was replaced by a new silence, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums like water pressure at depth. He found the operating room. It was a large chamber, circular, with a domed ceiling that had been reinforced with steel girders. In the center of the room stood a surgical table, stainless steel, stained with rust-brown residues that Nathan didn't want to identify. Above the table hung a cluster of surgical lamps, their bulbs shattered, their metal shades twisted as if by tremendous force. The floor was concrete, but it was covered in a layer of organic material that crunched beneath Nathan's boots like old leaves. He shone his flashlight downward and saw that the material was hair. Gray hair, coarse and thick, mixed with fragments of bone and teeth and something that looked like fingernails but was curved like claws. The hair covered the entire floor of the operating room, piled in drifts against the walls, stuffed into corners, hanging from the exposed pipes like Spanish moss. It was the sheddings of a creature that had lived here for a very long time. A creature that had molted and regrown and molted again, year after year, decade after decade, in the darkness beneath the earth. Nathan's hand was shaking so badly that the flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating things that he wished he hadn't seen. Diagrams pinned to corkboards, showing the musculature of a wolf superimposed over the skeleton of a human. Photographs of subjects, Margaret Holt, Eleanor Sterling, and others whose faces Nathan didn't recognize, in various stages of transformation. Their skin splitting, their bones elongating, their faces stretching into shapes that were neither human nor animal but something monstrously in between. And in the corner of the room, partially hidden by a drift of shed hair, Nathan found the cages. They were steel, reinforced, designed to contain something far stronger than a human being. The bars were bent outward, twisted by force that must have been tremendous, and the doors hung open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Inside the cages, Nathan could see scratches on the floor, deep gouges in the concrete, made by claws that had scraped and scraped in the darkness, counting the hours until the door opened and the hunger could be unleashed. There were 3 cages. 2 of them were empty, their doors torn from their hinges, their bars twisted into abstract sculptures of violence. The 3rd cage was different. Its door was closed. Its bars were intact. And inside, huddled in the corner with its arms wrapped around its knees, was something that Nathan at first mistook for a pile of rags. He approached slowly, his flashlight held before him like a talisman, his heart hammering so hard that he could feel it in his temples. The thing in the cage didn't move. It didn't breathe, or if it did, the breaths were so shallow that Nathan couldn't detect them. It was just a shape, a shadow, a suggestion of form in the darkness. "Hello," Nathan whispered, and his voice echoed off the concrete walls with a sound that was too loud, too revealing, too exposed. The thing in the cage stirred. It was a small movement at first, a shifting of weight, a rustle of fabric, a whisper of motion that might have been the settling of dust. But then the head lifted, and Nathan saw the face, and his scream died in his throat before it could be born. It was a woman, or it had been a woman once. The face was human, unmistakably human, with high cheekbones and full lips and eyes that were a deep, unsettling gold. The hair was long and dark, tangled with debris and age, but still recognizably human hair. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and in the beam of Nathan's flashlight he could see the veins beneath it, blue and branching like rivers on a map. But the body, oh God, the body was wrong. The torso was human, or nearly human, with breasts that had sagged with age, and a belly that was distended with malnutrition or pregnancy or something worse. But the arms were too long, ending in hands that were covered in coarse gray fur, the fingers tipped with claws that curved like scythes. And below the waist, the body twisted into something that was not human at all, a quadrupedal posture, legs that bent in the wrong direction, feet that were paws, claws that clicked against the concrete floor as the thing shifted its weight. The creature, the woman, the thing, looked at Nathan with those golden eyes, and it smiled. The smile was the worst part, because it was Eleanor Sterling's smile, the same smile that Nathan had seen in newspaper photographs from 1970, the same smile that had greeted guests at charity galas and garden parties and political fundraisers. It was a practiced smile, a social smile, a smile that said welcome and I am harmless and come closer, I won't bite. But the teeth behind the smile were not Eleanor Sterling's teeth. They were too long, too sharp, too numerous, crowding a jaw that had been stretched and reformed to accommodate a dentition that no human mouth should ever possess. "Hello," the thing said, and its voice was Eleanor Sterling's voice, cultured and precise and warm as honey. "I've been waiting for you, Nathan. I've been waiting for so long." Nathan stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand and clattering against the concrete. The beam spun wildly, illuminating fragments of the room, the cages, the hair, the photographs of transformations that had been nightmares made flesh. And then the flashlight rolled to a stop, its beam pointing directly at the thing in the third cage. "Don't be afraid," the creature said, and it shifted its weight, moving closer to the bars with a sinuous grace that was part seduction and part threat. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not like the others. I can control it. I can control the hunger. I just need someone to talk to, someone who understands." Nathan's back hit the wall. He was trapped, cornered, his escape blocked by the creature that was watching him from the cage with eyes that glowed like lanterns in the darkness. He thought of Clara's warning. The wolf woman's human face is not a deformity. It is a lure. She uses it to make you come closer. "You're not Eleanor Sterling," Nathan said, and his voice was barely a whisper. The creature laughed, and the laugh was a terrible thing. A sound that began as a woman's musical chuckle and ended as something that was closer to a bark, a growl, a predator's warning. "Of course I am," it said. "I'm Eleanor and Margaret and Sarah and all the others. I'm everyone who ever looked into the dark and found something looking back. I'm the face you trust, Nathan. I'm the voice you love. I'm the mother who read you bedtime stories and told you that monsters weren't real." Nathan felt his blood run cold. "How do you know about my mother?" "I know everything," the creature whispered, and it pressed its face against the bars of the cage, its golden eyes fixed on Nathan's with an intensity that was almost physical. "I know your mother's voice, Nathan. I know the way she sounded when she called you in from the yard. I know the way she laughed when you brought her dandelions. I know the way she screamed when the cancer ate through her bones. And I know," the smile widened, showing more teeth, "that you would give anything to hear her voice one more time." "Stop it," Nathan whispered. "Nathan," the creature said, and its voice shifted, changed, became something that Nathan recognized with a shock that was like being struck by lightning. "Nathan, baby, come here. Come to Mama. I miss you so much." It was his mother's voice. Exactly his mother's voice. The warmth, the cadence, the slight Alabama drawl that she had never quite lost despite decades in Birmingham. It was the voice that had read him "Goodnight Moon" and bandaged his scraped knees and told him on the last night of her life that she was proud of him and that she loved him and that she would always be there somehow, watching over him. "Stop it," Nathan said again, but his voice was breaking, tears streaming down his face. His hands pressed against the wall behind him as if he could push through the concrete and escape into the earth itself. "Come closer, baby," the creature crooned in his mother's voice. "Let me see your face. Let me hold you. It's been so long since I held you, Nathan. So long since I felt your warmth." Nathan took a step forward. He couldn't help it. The voice was too perfect, too familiar, too full of the love that he had lost and mourned and tried to forget. He took another step, and another, until he was standing at the bars of the cage, looking down at the thing that wore his mother's voice like a mask. The creature looked up at him with golden eyes that held no humanity whatsoever, and it smiled. "Closer," it whispered. Nathan reached out his hand. And then the thing in the cage moved. It moved faster than Nathan's eyes could follow, faster than his reflexes could react, faster than anything that should have been possible for a creature that had been sitting still for God knew how long. The clawed hand shot through the bars, grabbed Nathan's wrist, and pulled him forward with a strength that was inhuman, irresistible, absolute. Nathan slammed against the bars, his face inches from the creature's face. His wrist held in a grip that was crushing the bones together with a pressure that was going to break them, going to snap them, going to leave him maimed and screaming in the darkness. "You should have run," the creature said, and its voice was no longer his mother's voice. It was something deeper, older, hungrier, a voice that spoke from a throat that had been designed for growls and howls and the tearing of flesh. "You should have run when you had the chance, Nathan Cole, because now you're mine, and I have been so very, very hungry." The jaws opened, wider than any human jaws should have been able to open, and Nathan saw the throat behind the teeth, pink and wet and pulsing with a hunger that had no end. He smelled the creature's breath, copper and rot and something that might have been perfume, Eleanor Sterling's perfume, dabbed behind ears that were no longer entirely human. He closed his eyes and waited for the pain. It didn't come. Instead, there was a sound from the darkness beyond the operating room, a crash, a tumble, the clatter of something heavy falling in the corridor. The creature's head whipped toward the sound, its ears, pointed, furry, unmistakably lupin, perking up with an alertness that was pure animal instinct. "No," the creature hissed, and its grip on Nathan's wrist loosened, just for a moment, just enough. Nathan pulled free. He stumbled backward, his broken wrist cradled against his chest, his eyes fixed on the thing in the cage that was snarling now, slamming its body against the bars with a force that made the steel ring like a bell. "Come back," it screamed in his mother's voice, and then in Eleanor Sterling's voice, and then in a voice that was neither human nor animal but something that existed in the space between, a howl that was also a word, a scream that was also a song. "Come back, Nathan. Come back to me. I love you, I need you. I'm so hungry." Nathan ran. He ran through the operating room, through the corridors, through the office with its yellowed papers and its photographs of transformations. He ran up the stairs and through the rusted steel door and into the Alabama afternoon, where the sun was setting and the air was cool, and the woods were alive with the sounds of insects and birds and things that were not monsters. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, and he didn't stop driving until he was back at the Delta Breeze Motel, where he locked the door and pushed the dresser against it, and sat on the bed with his broken wrist cradled in his lap, shaking so violently that the mattress creaked beneath him. It was hours before he could think clearly enough to examine his wrist. It was swollen and bruised, the skin already darkening to purple, but the bones, miraculously, impossibly, were intact. The creature had held him with enough force to crush stone, and yet his wrist was only sprained. Because it hadn't wanted to break him, Nathan realized with a chill that spread from his spine to his fingertips. It had wanted to hold him, to keep him, to savor him. The pain would have come later, after the capture, after the cage door opened, after the creature had finished playing with its food. He sat on the bed until dawn, watching the shadows on the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the motel, the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of the faucet, the distant rumble of trucks on the interstate. And somewhere in the darkness between his thoughts, he heard something else. Something that might have been the wind, or might have been a dog howling in the distance, or might have been a woman's voice calling his name from the woods that surrounded the motel like a wall. "Nathan," the wind whispered. "Come back, Nathan, I'm still waiting." He didn't sleep that night. He didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. He spent his days researching Sterling Pharmaceuticals through unofficial channels, underground medical journals, conspiracy forums, contacts in the true crime community who owed him favors. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to understand the full scope of what had been done in the laboratory beneath the Sterling estate. Project Cannies had not been a curse. It had not been supernatural. It had been science, horrible, unethical, unforgivable science, conducted by men who had believed that the boundaries between species were walls that could be breached with enough knowledge and enough hubris. The process had involved a primitive form of cross-species grafting, using hormonal manipulation and genetic recombination to fuse human and lupin DNA. The subjects had been injected with a serum derived from wolf pituitary glands, combined with synthetic hormones that promoted rapid cellular transformation. The goal, the insane, impossible goal, had been to create a hybrid organism that possessed the intellectual capacity of a human being and the physical capabilities of a wolf. Margaret Holt had been the first subject. She had survived the transformation, but the resulting creature had been uncontrollable, a monster that retained fragments of human memory but was driven entirely by predatory instinct. She had been destroyed by fire, her remains studied, her failures analyzed. Eleanor Sterling had been the second subject. The scientists had refined their process, using what they had learned from Margaret's transformation to create a creature that was more stable, more intelligent, more controllable. And for a time, it had worked. Eleanor had retained her personality, her memories, her social graces. She had been able to speak, to reason, to follow commands. But the hunger had always been there. The wolf instincts, buried beneath the human veneer, waiting for the moment when the facade cracked and the predator emerged. And when Eleanor had escaped, when she had turned on her creators and fled into the woods, she had taken the hunger with her. The records Nathan found, leaked documents, anonymous testimonials, fragments of the sealed files that had survived the decades, suggested that Project Cannies had not ended with Eleanor Sterling. There had been other subjects, other experiments, other creatures that had been created and contained and destroyed in the years since 1971. The pharmaceutical company had changed its name, moved its operations, buried its past beneath layers of corporate restructuring and legal maneuvering. But the creatures had never been fully accounted for. Some had been killed in the laboratory, burned or shot or dissected for further study. Some had escaped into the wild, hunted down by private security teams and disappeared from official records. But at least one, perhaps more, had survived, had hidden, had learned to live in the spaces between human civilization and the wilderness that surrounded it. Nathan read the documents with a growing sense of dread, his broken wrist throbbing in time with his heartbeat, his mother's voice still echoing in his ears. The creature in the cage had not been Eleanor Sterling. Or rather, it had been Eleanor Sterling in the same way that a snake was still an egg, transformed beyond recognition, consumed by the thing that had grown inside her, wearing her face like a costume that had been tailored to fit a monster. But it had known his mother's voice. It had known his name. It had known things that no one should have known, things that it could not have learned from any file or photograph or recorded interview. Which meant that the creature was not just mimicking voices. It was absorbing them, stealing them from the minds of its victims, cataloging them like a librarian of souls, using them to lure the next generation of prey with the sounds of the people they loved most. Nathan thought of the photographs in the laboratory, the faces of Margaret Holt and Eleanor Sterling, and the others whose names he didn't know. He thought of their eyes, human and desperate, staring out from behind the bars of cages that had become their tombs. He thought of the sound of Eleanor Sterling's laugh, rising through the dawn like the sound of breaking glass. And he thought of his mother's voice, stolen from his memory and used as bait by a creature that had never known her, never loved her, never held him in arms that were warm and human and safe. He would go back to the estate. He would find the den that Clara had mentioned, the place where the creature had hidden for 50 years, waiting and watching and hungering. He would document everything, record everything, expose the truth to the world in a podcast that would be downloaded by millions. But first, he would find a way to stop the creature from using his mother's voice. He would find a way to take back what had been stolen from him, to reclaim the memory of the woman who had loved him from the monster that had weaponized that love. He didn't know how, he didn't know if it was possible, but he knew that he couldn't leave Alabama without trying. Because somewhere in the ruins of the Sterling estate, something was waiting for him. Something that wore his mother's face and spoke with his mother's voice and hungered for the warmth of human flesh. And Nathan Cole was done running. Nathan did not return to the Sterling estate immediately. He spent 3 days in the Delta Breeze Motel, his broken wrist wrapped in an ace bandage from the first aid kit in his car, his mind cycling through the information he had gathered with the obsessive thoroughness of a man trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept changing shape. He reviewed the sealed files, the laboratory notes, Clara's photograph of Margaret Holt. He mapped the locations of the 1971 sightings on a topographical chart he had purchased from a hiking store in Mobile, marking each death with a red pin and each reported sighting with a blue one. And on the third night, as the moon rose full and yellow over the Alabama scrub, he saw the pattern. The sightings did not radiate outward from the Sterling estate, as he had assumed. They did not follow the natural contours of the land, the ridgelines and riverbeds that dictated the movement of predators in the wild. Instead, they formed a perfect circle, a geometric precision that was unmistakable, unnatural, deliberately constructed. 12 locations, 12 deaths, 12 points on a circumference that measured exactly 1 mile in diameter, and at the center of the circle, where the lines converged with mathematical exactitude, was the limestone sinkhole that Clara Whitfield had mentioned in her interview. Nathan stared at the map for hours, his finger tracing the circle again and again, his mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. Predators did not hunt in geometric patterns. Animals did not arrange their kills in concentric formations. This was not the behavior of a wolf or a bear or any natural creature that Nathan had ever studied or read about. This was the behavior of something that thought, something that planned, something that understood geometry and symbolism and the psychological impact of patterns on the human mind. The wolf woman was not just hunting. She was creating something, building something, using the bodies of her victims as components in a design that Nathan couldn't understand but that filled him with a dread so profound it made his stomach clench. He thought of the reports from 1971, the mutilated bodies, the exsanguinated corpses, the strange arrangements of remains that the police had dismissed as the random violence of a rabid animal. He thought of the taxidermist's note, the description of Mrs. Sterling's skin splitting open to reveal the fur beneath. He thought of the thing in the laboratory cage, wearing his mother's voice like a stolen garment. And he knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic and settled in his bones like winter cold, that the circle was not complete, that something was waiting at the center of the design, something that had been waiting for 50 years, patient and hungry and utterly without mercy. He had to see the sinkhole. The Sterling estate was located 5 miles north of the town of Plateau, at the end of a private road that had been reclaimed by nature in the decades since the property had been abandoned. Nathan drove as far as he could, his rental car bouncing over ruts and roots that had cracked the asphalt like eggshells, until the road ended in a wall of kudzu that was taller than his car and denser than any wall of stone. He parked and continued on foot, his flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other, the map on the screen glowing with the red and blue pins that marked the circle of death. The night was warm, humid, alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs and the distant hooting of owls. But as Nathan walked deeper into the estate grounds, the sounds began to fade. The crickets fell silent. The frogs stopped their chorus. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving Nathan in a bubble of unnatural quiet that pressed against his eardrums like water. The mansion appeared suddenly, emerging from the darkness like a ship from fog. It was a Victorian monstrosity, 3 stories of weathered wood and broken windows, and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle like a tired smile. The paint had peeled away decades ago, revealing gray wood beneath that had been silvered by sun and rain into the color of old bones. The roof was partially collapsed, the chimneys tilting at drunken angles, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it had been pushed by a wind that never stopped blowing. Nathan stood at the edge of the overgrown lawn, staring up at the dark windows, and he felt the same sensation he had experienced in the laboratory, the sense of being watched, of being studied, of being measured by eyes that glowed in the darkness with a patience that had no end. "I'm not afraid of you," he whispered to the darkness, and his voice sounded small and hollow in the stillness. The darkness did not answer, but somewhere in the trees behind him, a branch cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Nathan spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the undergrowth, illuminating nothing but leaves and shadows and the endless, waiting dark. He stood frozen for a long moment, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. Just a deer, he told himself. Just a possum, just the wind. But the wind had died, and the sound had been too sharp, too deliberate, too much like a footstep on dry wood. He turned back to the mansion and forced himself to move forward, one step at a time, his boots crunching through the knee-high grass that had swallowed the lawn. The porch stairs groaned beneath his weight, threatening to collapse, and the boards of the porch itself were spongy with rot, sagging in places where the foundation had settled or termites had eaten away the supports. The front door was unlocked. It swung open with a shriek of rusted hinges, revealing a foyer that smelled of mold and mouse droppings and the particular mustiness of a place that had been closed up for decades. Nathan stepped inside, his flashlight beam dancing across peeling wallpaper and a grand staircase that curved upward into darkness, its banister warped and covered in cobwebs that glistened like silver in the light. The interior of the mansion was a time capsule of 1971. Furniture that had been expensive once now sagged beneath layers of dust and mouse nests. A chandelier that had probably sparkled with crystal now hung crookedly from the ceiling, its arms empty, its frame draped in cobwebs. Paintings, landscapes, portraits, abstract canvases that had probably been fashionable in their day, hung crooked on the walls, their colors faded to watery ghosts of their former vibrancy. Nathan moved through the rooms with the cautious deliberation of a man who knows he is trespassing in a tomb. The dining room table was still set for a meal that had never been eaten, china plates and crystal glasses and silverware that had tarnished to black, arranged with the formal precision of a household that had expected guests who never arrived. The library shelves held books that had swollen with moisture, their spines cracked, their pages stuck together in wads of pulp paper. The parlor smelled of old perfume and decaying upholstery, and in the corner, a gramophone sat on a side table, its horn pointed toward an empty chair, as if waiting for someone to wind it up and play the music that had died with the house. He found the entrance to the basement and the kitchen, behind a door that had been hidden by a china cabinet. The cabinet had been moved, recently, Nathan noted, because the drag marks in the dust were fresh, exposing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from the opening was the same smell he had encountered in the laboratory, copper and chemicals and something else, something organic and musky that made his hindbrain scream with recognition. It was the smell of predator, the smell of a den. Nathan stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, his flashlight beam probing the darkness below, his mind arguing with itself about whether to proceed. The rational part of him, the part that had built a successful podcast through careful research and methodical investigation, insisted that he should leave, should call the authorities, should report what he had found and let professionals handle whatever was waiting in the darkness. But the other part of him, the part that had driven him to abandoned hospitals in Ohio, to serial killer burial grounds in Kansas, to the sealed basements of murder houses across the American heartland, that part knew that he would go down those stairs, that he had to go down those stairs, because the story was down there, the truth was down there, and Nathan had never been able to walk away from a story, not once in 34 years of living. He descended. The stairs were wooden, steep, the steps sagging with age. They creaked beneath his weight with a sound that was too loud, too revealing, and Nathan found himself placing each foot with exaggerated care, trying to minimize the noise, as if the darkness below held something that could be alerted by sound. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a corridor that stretched into the distance, its walls lined with shelves that had once held preserves and provisions, but that now stood empty, their contents long since consumed by time and rats. The floor was concrete, cracked in places where tree roots had pushed through from above, and the ceiling was low enough that Nathan had to duck to avoid hitting his head on exposed beams. He walked slowly, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The corridor turned left, then right, then left again, and Nathan realized with a growing sense of unease that the basement was larger than the mansion above it, that it extended outward in all directions, a labyrinth of passages and chambers that had been carved into the limestone bedrock beneath the estate. This was the den, the place where the creature had lived for 50 years, the place where it had hidden, hunted, waited. He found the first chamber on his left. It had been a storage room once, but it had been transformed into something else entirely. The shelves had been torn from the walls, the debris swept into corners, and in the center of the room, something, had constructed a nest. It was made of hair. Gray hair, coarse and thick, woven together with fragments of cloth and bone and what looked like dried sinew. The nest was enormous, 6 feet in diameter, and it radiated outward from a central depression that was stained with something dark and flaking. Nathan approached it cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling, and he saw that the depression was lined with objects that had been arranged with deliberate care. A woman's shoe, size 7 he noted automatically, Eleanor Sterling's size. A wristwatch, its face cracked, its hand stopped at 3:47. The date window showed April 30, 1971. A ring, a wedding band, simple gold, inscribed with the initials ES plus RS. And photographs, dozens of photographs, arranged in a spiral pattern that radiated outward from the center of the nest like the petals of a flower. Nathan knelt and picked one up, his fingers brushing against the coarse hair of the nest, and he felt his stomach clench with revulsion and pity. The photograph showed a woman, Margaret Holt, he realized, recognizing her from Clara's picture, standing in what appeared to be a garden. She was smiling, her arms around the shoulders of 2 children who grinned up at the camera with gap-toothed innocence. The photograph was old, faded, creased down the middle as if it had been folded and carried in a pocket for years. Nathan picked up another photograph. This one showed a man in a police uniform, Deputy Franklin Hargrove, according to the name tag on his chest, standing beside a patrol car with his hand resting on the roof. He was young, maybe 30, with a mustache and kind eyes and the easy posture of a man who believed that the world was fundamentally a good place. Another photograph. An elderly couple on a porch swing, holding hands, looking at each other with an expression of love that had been captured in a moment of perfect contentment. Another, a child maybe 6 years old, standing in a yard with a red wagon, waving at the camera with sticky fingers. Another, a teenager in a graduation gown, holding a diploma, beaming with pride. They were all victims. Nathan realized it with a certainty that made his hands tremble. Every photograph in the nest was a victim of the wolf woman, the 12 people who had died in the circle of sightings, and perhaps others who had never been reported, never been found, never been mourned. The creature had taken their photographs as trophies, had arranged them in its nest like a bowerbird decorating its mating display, had slept surrounded by the images of the people it had destroyed. But why? What purpose did the photographs serve? What ritual was being enacted in this underground chamber, in the darkness beneath an abandoned mansion? Nathan stood up, his knees cracking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The smell in the room was overwhelming now, the musk of the creature, the copper of old blood, the chemical tang of the laboratory that permeated everything in this place. He needed to leave. He needed to run back up the stairs and out into the night and drive away from Plateau and never come back. But something drew him deeper. Something pulled him forward down the corridor, toward the chambers that waited in the darkness beyond. He found the second chamber 50 feet down the corridor. This one was different. This one was not a nest but a gallery, a space where the walls had been cleared of shelves and decorated with something that made Nathan's flashlight beam shake in his grip. Rib cages. 12 of them, mounted on the walls like hunting trophies, arranged in a perfect circle that mirrored the pattern of the sightings on Nathan's map. The ribcage were cracked open, not savagely but surgically, the bones spread apart to expose the cavities where hearts and lungs had once beaten and breathed. They were clean, picked clean, stripped of every fragment of flesh by jaws that were precise as scalpels and hungry as fire. But the horror was not in the ribcage themselves. The horror was in what had been done with them. Each ribcage held something in its hollow interior, something that glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with Nathan's flashlight. He approached the first one, his legs moving without his conscious volition, his eyes fixed on the glow that pulsed inside the bone cage like a heartbeat. It was an organ, a heart, perhaps, or a liver. Nathan couldn't tell in the dim light, and his knowledge of anatomy was insufficient to identify the mass of tissue that had been arranged in the ribcage with such deliberate care. But it was not just an organ. It was an organ that had been modified, transformed, merged with something that glistened and moved with a life of its own. The tissue was covered in fur, short, gray fur that grew directly from the organ's surface, as if the creature had been trying to cultivate a skin, a pelt, a covering that would allow it to pass for human in the daylight world above. Nathan stumbled backward, his hand clamped over his mouth, his eyes wide and streaming. The other ribcages held similar contents, organs that had been harvested and transformed and arranged in the bone cages like offerings in a temple. A lung that breathed with fur, a kidney that pulsed with hair, a stomach that digested nothing but grew a coat of coarse gray pelt that waved in the faint breeze from the corridor like seaweed in a current. The creature was building something. The realization hit Nathan with the force of physical blow, staggering him against the opposite wall, his fingers scraping against the rough concrete. It was building a new body, using the organs of its victims as raw material, stitching them together with its own transformed tissue, creating a composite organism that would be part human and part wolf, and part something else entirely. The circle of sightings was not just a hunting pattern. It was a harvesting pattern. The creature had been collecting components for 50 years, storing them in this underground den, waiting for the moment when it had enough material to complete its design. And Nathan was standing in the middle of its workshop. He ran. He ran from the gallery of ribcage down the corridor, past the nest of hair and photographs, toward the stairs that led up to the mansion and the night and the sanity of the world above. He ran with a speed that he didn't know he possessed, his lungs burning, his sprained wrist throbbing, his mind screaming at him to move faster, faster, before the thing that lived here returned to find an intruder in its home. He reached the stairs and took them 3 at a time, his boots thundering against the wood, the sound echoing through the basement like thunder. He burst through the kitchen door, into the mansion, through the foyer, out onto the sagging porch, into the overgrown lawn. And there he stopped, because the mansion was surrounded. They stood in a circle around the house, 12 of them, one for each point on the map, one for each ribcage in the gallery below. They were shapes in the darkness, silhouettes that blurred at the edges as if they were not fully solid, not fully real, not fully present in the world that Nathan inhabited. They stood on 2 legs and on 4, in postures that shifted and changed with each blink of Nathan's eyes. And they were all wearing faces. Human faces. Faces that Nathan recognized from the photographs in the nest. Margaret Holt's gentle smile, Deputy Hargrove's kind eyes, the elderly couple's shared contentment, the child's sticky-fingered wave. Faces that were stretched too tight over skulls that were the wrong shape, that smiled with mouths that had too many teeth, that opened to speak with voices that were not their own. "Welcome home, Nathan," they said in unison, and the sound was his mother's voice, multiplied by 12, harmonized into a chorus of love and hunger that made Nathan's knees buckle beneath him. "We saved a place for you," the faces said, and they began to move forward, their blurred edges resolving into claws and fur and teeth, their human masks slipping to reveal the golden eyes that glowed beneath. Nathan ran. He ran through the circle, ducking under a swipe of claws that passed so close to his face that he felt the wind of their passage. He ran across the lawn, through the kudzu, down the ruined road toward his car. Behind him, he heard the sounds of pursuit, pounding feet and clicking claws and voices that called his name in a dozen different tones, a dozen different memories, a dozen different traps. "Nathan," his mother called, "come back, baby, I'm waiting for you." "Mr. Cole," Deputy Hargrove shouted, "stop, we need to talk." "Help me," a child's voice squealed. "Help me, mister, I'm scared." Nathan ran faster, his lungs searing, his vision narrowing to a tunnel of darkness and fear. He reached his car, fumbled for the keys, dropped them in the dirt, scrabbled for them with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit were closer now, the footsteps thundering down the road, the voices rising in a chorus of welcome that was also a threat. He found the keys. He unlocked the door. He threw himself into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition, his foot stamping on the gas before the engine had even turned over. The car roared to life. Nathan slammed it into drive and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching and launching the vehicle forward with a squeal of rubber. In his rearview mirror, he saw the shapes on the road, the 12 figures that stood in a circle that was now complete, their faces turned toward the retreating car, their mouths open in howls that were also laughter. He drove until he reached the interstate, until the lights of Mobile appeared on the horizon, until his hands stopped shaking enough that he could grip the steering wheel without slipping. He drove until dawn, checking his rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see a face in the backseat, a claw on the door handle, a golden eye reflecting his headlights from the darkness behind. But there was nothing, only the road and the night and the slowly fading echo of his mother's voice calling him home. He checked into a motel on the outskirts of Mobile, a chain establishment with clean sheets and functioning air conditioning, and a television that played nothing but infomercials and early morning news. He locked the door and pushed the dresser against it and sat on the bed with his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking slightly, staring at the wall. The creature was not alone. That was the truth he had discovered in the basement of the Sterling estate. There were others, dozens of them, perhaps, or hundreds, creatures that wore human faces and spoke with human voices, and hunted with a patience that was older than civilization. They had been created in the laboratory, released into the wild, left to breed and multiply and evolve in the darkness beneath the Alabama scrub. And they were building something that required human organs and human memories and human voices, something that would emerge from the darkness when the design was complete, when the circle was closed, when the last component had been harvested and arranged in the bone gallery below. Nathan didn't know what they were building. He didn't know what they wanted, what they planned, what horrors they were capable of unleashing on a world that had forgotten they existed. But he knew one thing with absolute, bone-deep certainty. He was not safe. No one was safe. And the wolf woman was not a legend, not a myth, not a ghost story to be told around campfires and dismissed with laughter. She was real, she was patient, and she had been waiting for Nathan Cole to come to Alabama. Because he was not just a journalist, he was not just a podcaster chasing a story. He was the next component, the next victim, the next voice to be stolen and added to the chorus that called from the darkness. And somewhere in the ruins of the Sterling estate, in the den beneath the mansion, the creatures were smiling with faces that were not their own, and they were waiting for him to come back. Because he would come back. He knew it, even as he sat on the motel bed, even as he told himself that he would drive to the airport and fly back to Birmingham and forget about Plateau and the wolf woman and the nightmare that waited in the Alabama woods. He would come back because the story was not finished, because the truth was still buried in the darkness, because his mother's voice was still being used as bait by a creature that had never known her, never loved her, never held him with arms that were warm and human and safe. And because, deep in the part of his mind that he could not control, he could still hear her calling him. "Nathan," the wind whispered through the motel air conditioner. "Come home, Nathan. Mama's waiting." He pulled the pillow over his head and lay in the darkness, shaking, until the sun came up and the world returned to something that resembled sanity. But the voice never stopped. It whispered in his dreams, in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence that followed every sound. And Nathan knew, with a dread that grew deeper with every passing hour, that he would follow that voice eventually, that he would walk back into the woods, that he would descend into the darkness beneath the Sterling estate. And that when he did, the faces would be waiting. All of them, every victim, every voice, every stolen memory, waiting to welcome him home. The motel room in Mobile became Nathan's prison. For 3 days after his escape from the Sterling estate, he barely left the bed. He ordered pizza and Chinese food through delivery apps, paid for them with credit cards that he knew would leave a trail but couldn't bring himself to care about. He watched television without comprehending what was on the screen. He slept in fits and starts, jerking awake every few hours with the certainty that something was standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with golden eyes that glowed in the darkness. The voice followed him. His mother's voice, speaking from the air conditioner's hum, from the refrigerator's compressor, from the static between radio stations. It called to him with words of love and longing and need, and Nathan learned to sleep with earplugs jammed into his ears, to shower with the bathroom fan roaring, to do anything that would drown out the whispers that came from everywhere and nowhere. But he could not drown out the memories. The image of the ribcage on the wall, the organs that grew fur, the 12 figures in the circle around the mansion. The knowledge that the wolf woman was not a single creature but a colony, a hive, a network of predators that shared faces and voices, and a hunger that had no end. On the 4th day, he began to research in earnest. He had his laptop, his phone, the notes he had compiled during his months of preparation. He expanded his search beyond the sealed files and into the margins of medical history, obscure journals, classified studies, whispers in the scientific community about experiments that had been conducted in the shadows of legitimate research. Sterling Pharmaceuticals had existed. He found proof in the archives of the Alabama Secretary of State, in corporate records that had been filed under a different name, but that bore the same address as the Sterling estate. The company had been incorporated in 1968, had operated for 3 years under the direction of a board of directors that included Judge Robert Sterling and 3 medical doctors whose names Nathan didn't recognize. The company's stated purpose was biological research and pharmaceutical development. Its actual purpose, Nathan discovered through a series of leaked documents he found on a dark web forum dedicated to medical conspiracy theories, was far more specific and far more terrifying. Project Canis was not just about creating a biological weapon. It was about creating a new kind of predator. The documents, scanned pages from notebooks that had been smuggled out of the laboratory by a technician who had subsequently disappeared, described a process that was part genetics, part surgery, part something that bordered on alchemy. The researchers had been trying to create a creature that could pass for human in daylight, that could infiltrate human society, that could get close to its prey without triggering the fear responses that normal predators inspired. The key insight, the breakthrough that had made the project possible, was the discovery that human beings were not afraid of human faces. They were not afraid of voices that spoke their language, of bodies that walked on 2 legs, of gestures that mimicked their own social behaviors. The human brain was wired to trust other humans, to approach them, to lower their defenses in the presence of familiar features and comforting voices. So the researchers had designed a creature that exploited this trust. A creature whose upper body, the face, the torso, the arms, was recognizably, reassuringly human. A creature that could smile and speak and extend a hand in greeting. A creature that could lure its victims close enough for the lower body, the quadrupedal, muscular, clawed lower body, to strike with the speed and force of a wolf. The documents described it as ambush predation via social mimicry. Nathan described it, in the notes he typed with trembling fingers, as the most terrifying thing I have ever encountered. Because the creature was not just wearing a human face, it was wearing a human identity. The researchers had discovered that the most effective lure was not a generic human form, but a specific, recognizable individual, someone the victim knew and loved and trusted. So they had designed the transformation process to absorb the memories, the voice patterns, the personality traits of the human host, incorporating them into the predator's behavioral repertoire. Elinor Sterling had not just become a wolf. She had become a wolf that remembered being Elinor Sterling. A wolf that could speak with Elinor Sterling's voice, that could recall Elinor Sterling's memories, that could access the social knowledge and emotional connections that Elinor Sterling had built over 52 years of life. And when she hunted, she didn't just hunt as a wolf. She hunted as Elinor Sterling, approaching her victims with the familiarity of an old friend, the warmth of a trusted confidant, the intimacy of a shared history. She could call them by name. She could reference shared experiences. She could make them feel safe, loved, understood. Right up until the moment when her jaw unhinged and her teeth closed around their throat. Nathan read the documents with a growing sense of horror that transcended fear and approached something like awe. The researchers had not created a monster. They had created a masterpiece, a biological machine of such exquisite precision, such diabolical ingenuity, that it made Nathan's understanding of predation seem naive and childish. The wolf woman was not a failed experiment. She was a triumph. A triumph that had escaped, that had bred, that had multiplied in the darkness beyond the laboratory's reach. The documents suggested that the researchers had created at least 20 subjects before the project was shut down, 20 men and women who had been transformed into ambush predators and released into the wild for field testing. Most had been killed by the security teams that hunted them, but some had survived. Some had learned to hide, to breed, to pass their engineered traits to offspring that were born as hybrids, creatures that were part human and part wolf from birth, that never knew any other form, that grew up understanding their dual nature as natural and normal. Nathan thought of the 12 figures in the circle around the mansion, the 12 faces that had worn the expressions of the dead, the 12 voices that had spoken in unison with his mother's words. They were not the original subjects. They were the descendants, the children and grandchildren of Margaret Holt and Elinor Sterling, and the others who had been transformed in the laboratory beneath the estate. They had inherited the ability to wear human faces, to speak with human voices, to hunt with human cunning. But they had also inherited something else, something that the researchers had not anticipated. The documents described it as genetic drift and phenotypic variation. Nathan, reading between the lines of scientific jargon that he barely understood, realized what it meant. The creatures were evolving. Each generation was different from the one before. Some retained more human characteristics, upright posture, articulate speech, fine motor control. Others were more lupine, quadrupedal movement, limited vocalization, enhanced sensory abilities. And some, the documents hinted at this with language that was deliberately vague, as if the researchers had been afraid to commit their observations to paper. Some were developing traits that had not been present in the original design. Traits like the ability to share faces, to exchange voices, to create a collective identity that transcended individual bodies. Nathan thought of the 12 figures in the circle, all speaking with his mother's voice. He thought of the gallery of ribcage, the organs that grew fur, the nest of photographs arranged like a shrine. The creatures were not just hunting individuals anymore. They were building something, a network, a hive, a collective organism that used human bodies as components in a larger design. And Nathan was beginning to understand what that design was. He found the answer in the oldest of the leaked documents, a notebook that had been written in 1970, before the first transformation, when the researchers were still theorizing about what their creation might become. The ultimate goal of Project Cannies, the notebook read, is not merely to create a biological weapon or a surveillance asset. The ultimate goal is to create a successor species, a life form that combines the adaptive intelligence of Homo sapiens with the ecological efficiency of Canis lupus, a predator that can replace humanity as the dominant species on this planet, not through conflict but through integration. Nathan read the passage 3 times, his mouth going dry, his hands trembling on the keyboard. Integration, not extermination, not conquest, integration. The researchers had envisioned a future in which their creations did not hunt humans to extinction, but absorbed them, incorporated them, used human society as a substrate for their own expansion. A future in which the creatures wore human faces and held human jobs and raised human children, all while maintaining their predatory nature in the spaces between the mundane moments of daily life. A future in which the wolf lived inside the human, and the human never knew the difference. The beauty of the design, the notebook continued, is its invisibility. The creature's human half is not a disguise, it is a lure. It attracts prey by offering connection, intimacy, love. The victim comes willingly, eagerly, gratefully. And by the time they realize what has happened, they are already part of the network. Their face becomes another mask. Their voice becomes another call. Their memories become another tool in the arsenal of predation. Nathan slammed the laptop shut. He couldn't read anymore, couldn't think anymore, couldn't sit in this motel room, surrounded by the humming of machines and the whispering of voices, and contemplate a future in which monsters wore his neighbors' faces and spoke with his loved ones' voices. He needed air. He needed to move. He needed to do something that would break the paralysis that had gripped him since his escape from the Sterling estate. He grabbed his jacket and his keys and walked out into the Mobile night. The city was alive around him, cars on the interstate, music from bars and clubs, the distant sound of a ship's horn from the port. Nathan walked without destination, letting his feet carry him through neighborhoods he didn't know, past buildings he had never seen. He walked until his legs ached and his lungs burned, and the voice in his head had been replaced by the simple, mechanical rhythm of his own footsteps. And then he saw her. She was standing on the corner of a street that Nathan didn't recognize, beneath a streetlight that flickered with the dying pulse of an old bulb. She was wearing a dress that might have been fashionable in the 1970s, a floral print, modest cut, belted at the waist, and her hair was styled in a way that reminded Nathan of photographs he had seen in his mother's albums. Her face was turned away from him, toward the street, and Nathan told himself to keep walking, to cross the road, to go anywhere but toward this woman who was standing alone on a dark corner in a city full of strangers. But his feet stopped, his breath caught, and his heart, his treacherous, traitorous heart, began to beat with a rhythm that was not fear but recognition. The woman turned toward him, and Nathan looked into the face of his mother. She was younger than he remembered, younger than she had been when she died, maybe 45, with the smooth skin and bright eyes that cancer had not yet stolen. She smiled at him, and the smile was exactly right. The slight asymmetry of the left side, the crinkle at the corners of the eyes, the warmth that had made Nathan feel safe even in his darkest moments. "Hello, baby," she said, and her voice was perfect, absolutely perfect, the Alabama drawl and the gentle cadence and the love that had been the soundtrack of his childhood. "You're not real," Nathan whispered. "You're not her, you're one of them." The smile faltered, just for a moment, just long enough for Nathan to see the calculation behind it, the predatory assessment of a hunter sizing up prey that was not behaving as expected. "Of course I'm real," the thing said, and it took a step toward him, its hands extended in the gesture of embrace that Nathan had craved for 5 years. "I'm your mother, Nathan. I've missed you so much. Won't you come give me a hug?" Nathan backed away. His heel caught on the curb and he stumbled, catching himself on a parking meter. The thing, the creature wearing his mother's face, continued to advance, its smile fixed, its eyes bright with a hunger that was barely concealed beneath the mask of maternal love. "I know what you are," Nathan said, and his voice was stronger than he felt. "I know about Project Cannies. I know about the lure. I know that your human half is designed to make me come closer so your wolf half can tear out my throat." The thing stopped. The smile dropped away, replaced by an expression that was neither human nor animal but something chillingly in between, curiosity and hunger, and a kind of predatory amusement. "You know so much," it said, and its voice was changing now, losing the Alabama drawl, gaining harmonics that made Nathan's teeth ache. "But you understand so little. We're not trying to kill you, Nathan. We're trying to welcome you, to make you part of something larger than yourself, something eternal." "I don't want to be part of you," Nathan said. "Everyone wants to be part of something," the creature said. "That's the nature of being human, the need for connection, for family, for love. We offer you all of that, Nathan. We offer you a place in our network, a face that will never age, a voice that will never die, the love of a mother who will never leave you." It took another step forward, and Nathan saw what he had missed before. The way the dress hung wrong on the body beneath it, the shoulders too broad, the hips too narrow, the posture subtly off-kilter, as if the creature were balancing on legs that bent in directions human joints were not meant to bend. "You're not my mother," Nathan said. "I am now," the creature said. "I have her voice, her memories, her love for you. I know the lullaby she sang when you couldn't sleep. I know the way she held you when you had nightmares. I know the last words she spoke to you before the cancer took her consciousness. Be brave, Nathan, be brave and know that I love you." Nathan felt tears streaming down his face, hot and humiliating and utterly beyond his control. The creature was using his mother's last words as a weapon, wielding them with a precision that was calculated and cruel and absolutely effective. "Stop it," he whispered. "Come to me, Nathan," the creature crooned, and its arms opened wider and Nathan could see the claws now extending from beneath the sleeves of the floral dress, sharp and curved and ready. "Let me hold you. Let me love you. Let me make you part of the family." Nathan ran. He ran down the street, around the corner, through alleys and parking lots and empty lots that smelled of garbage and cat piss. He ran until his lungs were on fire and his legs were jelly, and his mind was screaming at him to stop, to turn around, to go back to the thing that wore his mother's face and let it hold him one more time. He didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He ran all the way back to the motel, locked the door, pushed the dresser against it, and collapsed onto the bed, shaking and sobbing and hating himself for the weakness that had almost made him surrender. Because he had wanted to go to her. He had wanted, more than anything in the world, to believe that the thing on the street corner was really his mother, that she had somehow survived death, that she had come back for him. That was the horror of the design, not the claws or the teeth or the inhuman strength, but the lure, the promise of connection, of love, of reunion with the dead. The creature didn't hunt with violence, it hunted with hope. And hope was the most dangerous weapon of all. Nathan lay on the bed until dawn, watching the ceiling, listening to the silence. The voice had stopped, his mother's voice, the voices of the 12 figures, all the voices that had been calling him since he arrived in Alabama. They had stopped because they didn't need to call anymore. They had found him. They had shown him what they could do, and now they were waiting for him to come to them. because that was how the trap worked. The creature couldn't chase effectively in an urban environment. It couldn't hunt in a world of crowds and cameras and forensic science. So it didn't chase. It waited. It planted the seed of longing in its victim's mind, and then waited for that seed to grow into an obsession that would bring the victim back to the hunting ground. Nathan knew this. He understood the mechanism. He could see the trap for what it was. But he also knew, with a despair that sank into his bones like cold water, that he would go back to the Sterling estate eventually. Because the seed had been planted. The longing had been awakened. And the part of him that was still a grieving son, still a child who had lost his mother too soon, that part would never stop wanting to hear her voice again. Even if the voice came from a monster. Even if the embrace ended in death. Even if the reunion was just another component in the design, another face for the network, another voice for the chorus. He would go back, he knew it, the creature knew it. And somewhere in the darkness, in the den beneath the ruined mansion, the wolf woman was smiling with his mother's smile, and she was waiting. Nathan left Mobile on the 5th day, but he did not leave Alabama. He drove north, back toward Plateau, back toward the heart of the darkness that had swallowed his sanity. He told himself it was for the story, for the podcast, for the truth that he had promised his listeners he would uncover. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. He could not stay away. The voice had planted its hook in his mind, and every mile that carried him farther from the Sterling estate felt like a mile of drowning, of suffocation, of being pulled backward by a current that was stronger than his will to resist. He stopped at a diner just outside of Plateau, a squat cinder-block building with neon beer signs in the windows, and a clientele that looked like they had been sitting on the same stools since the Nixon administration. The coffee was black and bitter, the eggs were greasy, and the waitress, a woman in her 60s with a beehive hairdo and a name tag that read Darling, regarded Nathan with the suspicious scrutiny of small-town residents who could smell an outsider from 3 counties away. "You're that podcaster," she said, when she set his plate down with a clatter that made the silverware jump. "The one asking about the wolf woman." Nathan looked up, his fork halfway to his mouth. "How did you?" "Everybody knows everybody's business around here, honey. You think you're being subtle, driving around in a rental car with out-of-state plates, asking questions about things that decent folk don't talk about. You're about as subtle as a fart in church." Nathan set his fork down. "Do you know something about the wolf woman, Darlene?" Darlene leaned against the counter, her arms crossed over a bosom that had probably been impressive in her youth and was now formidable. "I know that April is a bad month to be in Plateau, always has been. My mama used to lock us in the cellar when the moon was full in April, said the wolf woman walked on nights like that." "And you believe that?" "I believe what I see with my own eyes." Darlene's voice dropped to a whisper, and she glanced toward the kitchen as if afraid of being overheard. "I believe that every April, for as long as I can remember, someone goes missing, someone new, someone who doesn't know the rules. And I believe that when they find the bodies, if they find the bodies, it's always the same, drained of blood, throat torn out, but the face," she shuddered, "the face is always peaceful, like they died happy, like they died loving whatever killed them." Nathan felt his appetite vanish. Every April. Every April, like clockwork, like something that breeds on a schedule. Darlene straightened up, her voice returning to its normal volume. "You want my advice, honey? You get back in that rental car and you drive until you hit Interstate 65, and then you keep driving until you see a sign that says, 'Welcome to Tennessee.' And you don't look back. Because whatever's out there in those woods, it's been waiting a long time for someone like you, someone smart, someone curious, someone who thinks they can understand it." "And what happens to people who think they can understand it?" Darlene's smile was thin and devoid of humor. "They become part of the April statistics, honey, every single one." Nathan ate his eggs in silence. Watching Darlene refill coffee cups for truckers and farmers who talked about the weather and the crops and the price of gas with the easy camaraderie of people who had never looked into the dark and seen something looking back. When he finished, he left a 20 on the counter, more than the meal was worth, but he couldn't bring himself to care about money anymore, and walked out into the parking lot. It was April 28th. 3 days until May. 3 days until the end of the season. 3 days until the creature that had been hunting him either succeeded or went dormant for another year, returning to its den to wait and hunger and plan. Nathan got into his car and drove toward the Sterling estate. He didn't know what he expected to find. The files, perhaps. The proof. The smoking gun that would allow him to tell the world about Project Cannies and the monsters it had created. Or maybe he expected nothing. Maybe he just wanted to see the place one more time, to stare into the darkness and make his peace with the fact that some stories were not meant to be told, some truths were not meant to be known, and some monsters were not meant to be understood. The road to the estate was as overgrown as he remembered, the kudzu wall as impenetrable. But this time, Nathan didn't try to drive. He parked his car at the edge of the property, half a mile from the mansion, and walked the rest of the way on foot. He moved quietly, carefully, placing each step with the deliberation of a man who knows he is being hunted. The mansion was as he had left it, sagging, rotten, staring at the sky with broken window eyes. But something had changed. The grass in the overgrown lawn had been trampled flat in a pattern that Nathan recognized with a chill. The circle. The 12-pointed circle that matched the sightings, the ribcage, the figures that had surrounded him on his last visit. The circle was complete now, and in its center, where the lines converged, stood the sinkhole. Nathan approached it cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gathering dusk. The sinkhole was larger than he had imagined, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, its edges crumbling limestone that glowed white in the beam of his light. The interior was darkness absolute, a void that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam without reflecting anything back. But it was not empty. Nathan heard sounds from the depths, wet sounds, organic sounds, the rhythmic pulsing of something that breathed and moved and lived in the hollow earth. And beneath those sounds he heard voices, whispers, fragments of conversation that rose and fell like surf on a distant shore. "Be brave, Nathan. Come home, baby. I've missed you so much." He stepped back from the edge, his heart hammering, his hands shaking so badly that he had to jam them into his pockets to keep from dropping the flashlight. The sinkhole was not just a geological feature. It was a nursery, a womb, a place where the creatures gathered to breed, to gestate, to bring forth the next generation of hybrids. And the voices were not just echoes. They were the voices of the unborn, the not yet fully formed, the fetal monsters that were developing in the darkness below, absorbing the memories and personalities of the victims whose organs had been fed into the pit. Nathan turned away from the sinkhole and ran toward the mansion. He needed to find the records, the documents, the proof that would allow him to expose this nightmare to the world. He needed to find something that would make sense of the horror, that would give him a weapon to use against the thing that wore his mother's face. He entered the mansion through the kitchen door, his flashlight beam dancing across the rotting floorboards and the cobwebbed ceiling. The basement stairs yawned before him, and he descended without hesitation, driven by a desperation that was stronger than his fear. The basement was as he remembered it, the corridors, the nest, the gallery of ribcages, but the ribcages were different now. They were occupied. In each cage of bone, a creature sat. Small, fetal, unfinished. They were the offspring of the wolf woman, the next generation of hybrids that had been gestating in the darkness. They had human faces, or something like human faces, but their bodies were wolf, and their eyes were golden, and their mouths were filled with teeth that were already too long for their skulls. They looked at Nathan with eyes that held no innocence, no curiosity, no fear, only hunger, only patience, only the endless, predatory waiting of creatures that had been born to hunt and knew nothing else. Nathan backed away, his breath coming in short gasps, his flashlight beam trembling across the faces of the unborn monsters. There were dozens of them, 12 in the ribcage and more in the shadows beyond, hidden in corners and crevices that his light could not penetrate. He turned and ran, not toward the stairs but deeper into the basement, driven by a panic that had no logic, no direction, no purpose except to escape the golden eyes that followed him through the darkness. He found the archive room by accident, bursting through a door that he hadn't seen before and stumbling into a space that was lined with filing cabinets and metal shelves. The shelves held boxes, dozens of boxes, hundreds of boxes, all labeled with dates and names and the clinical terminology of medical research. Nathan grabbed the nearest box and tore it open. Inside were letters, handwritten letters, typed letters, carbon copies of memos that had been sent between the researchers at Sterling Pharmaceuticals and their counterparts at other institutions across the country. He read them with shaking hands, his flashlight propped against a cabinet, its beam illuminating the pages with a light that was too dim and too yellow but sufficient for his purpose. "The breeding program has been more successful than anticipated," one letter read. Subject ES produced a litter of 6 in March 1972, all viable, all displaying the desired phenotypic characteristics. The offspring demonstrate enhanced cognitive abilities compared to subject MH's litter, suggesting that maternal intelligence plays a significant role in hybrid development. Another letter. "The April breeding season has been established as optimal for our purposes. The subjects become increasingly active during this period, displaying heightened aggression and enhanced mimicry abilities. We believe this is linked to hormonal changes associated with their reproductive cycle. Recommend that all field personnel exercise extreme caution during the month of April." And another, in a different hand, dated 1989. "The original subjects are deteriorating. Subject ES has not been seen in the laboratory for 18 months, and our tracking efforts have been unsuccessful. The offspring, however, continue to thrive in the wild. They have established a stable population in the woods surrounding the estate, and they have begun to display behaviors that were not anticipated in the original design. Specifically, they have developed the ability to exchange genetic material via a mechanism that we do not fully understand, a form of horizontal gene transfer that allows them to incorporate traits from their prey into their own offspring." Nathan lowered the letter, his mind reeling. The creatures were not just breeding, they were evolving. They were taking traits from their victims, memories, voices, perhaps even physical characteristics, and passing them on to their children. Each generation was more human, more perfect, more indistinguishable from the people they hunted. And the letters kept coming. Reports from the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. A network of researchers who had continued the work in secret, funding their experiments through shell companies and government grants and private donors who believed that the creation of a superior predator was a worthy scientific goal. The integration program has entered its final phase, a letter from 2015 read. "Our subjects have successfully infiltrated human society at multiple levels: local government, law enforcement, medical services. They wear their human faces with increasing skill and confidence, and their hunting success rate has reached 94%. We anticipate that within 2 generations, the distinction between Homo sapiens and Canis lupus superior will be purely academic." Nathan dropped the letter. He felt sick, dizzy, as if the floor beneath his feet had tilted and he was sliding toward an abyss that had no bottom. The creatures were not hiding in the woods. They were not lurking in basements and sinkholes and abandoned estates. They were everywhere. They were the mayors and the police chiefs and the doctors and the nurses. They were the people who smiled at you in the grocery store and asked about your day and invited you to neighborhood barbecues. They were the faces you saw on the evening news, the voices you heard on the radio, the hands that shook yours at church on Sunday morning. They were the world, and the world was a hunting ground. Nathan gathered as many letters as he could carry, stuffing them into his backpack with hands that trembled. He needed to get out. He needed to find a phone, a computer, a way to upload these documents to the internet where they could not be suppressed, could not be buried, could not be made to disappear like the original police files. He climbed the stairs from the basement, emerged into the kitchen, crossed the foyer toward the front door. The mansion was silent around him, empty of the voices that had haunted him, empty of the golden eyes that had watched him from the shadows. He reached the door and pulled it open. The circle was waiting for him. 12 figures stood in the overgrown lawn, arranged in the perfect geometric pattern that he had seen on his map. But they were different now. They were not the blurred shapes, the incomplete forms, the shifting silhouettes that he had encountered before. They were solid, real, complete. And they were all wearing his face. 12 Nathan Coles stood in the grass, their expressions identical, their postures identical, their clothes identical to the ones he was wearing at that very moment. They smiled at him with his own smile, and they spoke with his own voice, and they said the words that he had never spoken aloud but that had been echoing in his mind since his mother's death. "I want to go home," they said in unison. "I want to see her again. I want to hear her voice. I want to feel her arms around me. I want to be loved. I want to be whole. I want to stop being afraid." Nathan staggered backward, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. The creatures, the things wearing his face, began to move forward, their steps synchronized, their movements fluid and predatory and utterly inhuman. "We are you, Nathan," they said, and their voices were his voice, layered and harmonized into a chorus of self that was maddening, seductive, irresistible. "We are the part of you that wants to surrender, the part that wants to stop fighting, the part that wants to be part of something larger than loneliness and grief and fear." "No," Nathan whispered. "Yes," they said. "Come to us, Nathan. Let us complete the circle. Let us make you part of the family. Let us give you the immortality that your mother's death stole from you." Nathan turned and ran back into the mansion. He ran through the foyer, up the grand staircase, into the rooms above. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet, the walls seemed to close in around him, and behind him he heard the footsteps of the 12 Nathans, climbing the stairs with a patience that was more terrifying than any rush. He found a bedroom at the end of the hall, a room with a window that overlooked the back of the property. He slammed the door, locked it, and ran to the window, his fingers scrabbling at the latch. The window was stuck, painted shut by decades of neglect, and Nathan pounded at the frame with his fists, screaming with frustration and terror. The door behind him shook with the impact of something heavy. Once, twice, 3 times. The lock held, but the wood around it was splintering, and Nathan knew that it would not hold for long. He grabbed a chair from the corner of the room, an antique with a cane seat and a carved back, and swung it at the window with all his strength. The glass shattered, fragments spraying outward into the night. Nathan knocked out the remaining shards with the chair leg, cutting his hands in the process, and then he climbed through the window, onto the porch roof below, and slid down the drain pipe to the ground. He landed hard, his ankle twisting beneath him, pain shooting up his leg like electricity. He ignored it. He ran, limping, across the back lawn, through the trees, toward the road where his car waited. Behind him he heard voices calling his name, his own voice, multiplied by 12, speaking words of love and welcome and belonging. "Come back, Nathan. We're waiting for you. You belong with us." He reached his car, fumbled for the keys, unlocked the door with a hand that was slick with blood from the window glass. He threw himself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching and launching him forward. In his rearview mirror, he saw the 12 figures standing at the edge of the property, watching him go. They were smiling with his smile, waving with his hand, and their voices followed him down the road like a song that he could not forget. "We'll see you again, Nathan," they called. "Soon, very soon." Nathan drove until dawn, until he reached the interstate, until the voices faded into the background noise of the road. He drove without destination, without purpose, without any thought except to put distance between himself and the nightmare that had swallowed his identity. Because the creatures had his face now, they had his voice, they had his memories, his fears, his desires. And they would use them all to hunt the people he loved. The letters in his backpack were heavy with the weight of decades of conspiracy, of generations of monsters breeding in the dark. Nathan knew that he needed to publish them, to broadcast them, to scream the truth into every microphone and webcam and social media platform that would carry his voice. But he also knew that it wouldn't matter, that the creatures were too entrenched, too numerous, too perfect in their mimicry, that by the time the world believed him, the world would already be theirs. He was not just a journalist anymore. He was a witness, a survivor, a man who had looked into the face of the future and seen his own eyes staring back at him with a hunger that had no end. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like winter frost, that the wolf woman was not done with him, that she would never be done with him, that she had been waiting 50 years for someone like Nathan Cole, someone curious, someone brave, someone foolish enough to dig up the past, and now that she had found him, she would not let him go. The April breeding season was not over. The circle was not complete. And somewhere in the darkness, in the den beneath the ruined mansion, the creatures were nursing their young and planning their next hunt. A hunt that would begin, Nathan knew, with a voice he could not resist. His mother's voice, calling him home. Nathan found the motel by accident. He had been driving for hours, his mind numb, his body operating on autopilot while his thoughts circled the same impossible truths like a dog chasing its own tail. The letters in his backpack were evidence of a conspiracy that spanned decades, but they were also a death sentence. If the creatures were as integrated into human society as the documents suggested, then Nathan was not just a witness. He was a target, and every motel he checked into, every gas station he stopped at, every restaurant where he ate was potentially a trap. He had passed 3 chain hotels on the interstate before he saw the sign for the Sterling Motor Lodge, glowing in neon decay beside a Tulane County road. The sign was old, the paint peeling, the S in Sterling flickering on and off with the arrhythmic pulse of a failing heart. But the parking lot was empty, the vacancy sign was lit, and Nathan was too exhausted, too frightened, too far beyond rational thought to wonder why a motel would bear the same name as the family whose estate had become his nightmare. He checked in with a clerk who barely looked up from a television, playing a reality show at maximum volume. The room was number 14, at the end of the building, overlooking a field that stretched toward the dark line of trees that marked the edge of the Sterling property. Nathan didn't realize the proximity until he opened the curtains and saw the mansion's silhouette against the moonlit sky, 3 miles distant but unmistakable in its broken grandeur. The Sterling Motor Lodge had been built on the edge of the old estate, on land that had probably been sold off by the family in the years before Judge Sterling's death. The motel was close enough that Nathan could see the sinkhole's depression in the field between the parking lot and the woods, a darker circle in the darkness that seemed to pulse with a slow, organic rhythm. He should have left immediately, should have demanded his money back, gotten in his car, driven until he found a Holiday Inn or a Best Western or any place that wasn't within shouting distance of the hunting ground. But he was so tired, so bone-deep, soul-crushingly tired, and the bed was clean and the air conditioning was cold, and the door had a deadbolt that looked sturdy enough to hold against anything that might try to enter. He locked the door, pushed the dresser against it out of habit, and collapsed onto the bed without removing his shoes. He intended to rest for just a moment, to close his eyes and gather his strength for the drive back to Birmingham in the morning. He slept for 6 hours without dreaming. When he woke, it was to darkness so complete that he couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. The motel's neon sign had apparently failed entirely, and the parking lot outside his window was a void of black that seemed to press against the glass with physical weight. The air conditioning had shut off, and the room was warm, humid, filled with a silence that was not the absence of sound but the presence of something listening. Nathan lay still, his heart hammering, his ears straining for any noise that would tell him where he was, what time it was, whether he was alone. And then he heard it. A whisper, faint, rhythmic, coming from somewhere above him, from the ceiling, from the ventilation shaft. "Nathan!" The voice was soft, gentle, threaded with love and longing, and the particular cadence that Nathan had spent 5 years trying to forget. "Nathan, baby, I'm up here." He sat up in bed, his hand fumbling for the lamp on the nightstand. The switch clicked but produced no light. The power was out. The darkness was absolute. "Mom!" The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, torn from his throat by a hope that was stronger than his fear, stronger than his knowledge, stronger than the rational part of his mind that was screaming at him to run, to hide, to stuff his ears with anything that would block out the voice of the thing that was not his mother. "Yes, baby, it's me. I've been waiting for you to wake up. I've been so lonely, Nathan, so lonely without you." The voice was coming from the vent above the bed. Nathan looked up, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and he could see the rectangular outline of the ventilation grate in the ceiling. It was old, rusted, the screws that held it in place loose and corroded, and something was moving behind it. Something pale, something that pressed against the metal slats with fingers that were too long, too thin, tipped with claws that scraped against the aluminum with a sound like knives being sharpened. "Come up here, Nathan, come up here and see me. I have so much to tell you, so much to show you." "You're not real," Nathan whispered, but his voice was weak, trembling, the protest of a child who wants to believe in Santa Claus, despite knowing that the presents come from parents who stay up late and eat the cookies left on the mantel. "I'm as real as you are, baby. As real as the love between us. As real as the memory of your first steps, your first words, the first time you said, 'I love you, Mama,' and meant it." Tears streamed down Nathan's face, hot and humiliating and utterly beyond his control. The creature was using his memories, memories that were private, sacred, the foundation of his identity, as weapons. It knew the words that would open him, the phrases that would bypass his defenses, the stories that would make his heart ache with a longing that was physical, visceral, unbearable. "Please," he sobbed, "please stop. I can't stop loving you, Nathan. I can't stop wanting to be with you. That's what mothers do. We love our children forever, even after death, even after transformation, even after becoming something that the world would call a monster." The vent cover shifted. One screw popped loose, then another, and the grate hung crooked, revealing a slice of darkness that was not empty. Nathan could see eyes in that darkness. Golden eyes that glowed with their own light, that fixed on him with an intensity that was almost physical. "You're in the walls," Nathan said, and his voice was flat, dead, the voice of a man who has finally understood the scope of his predicament. "I've always been in the walls, baby. Since the day you were born. Since the day I first held you and smelled your skin and knew that I would do anything to protect you, even become this, even become something that lives in darkness and hunts in shadow, because that's what mothers do, Nathan. We become monsters for our children." The vent cover fell. It clattered against the bedspread, and Nathan scrambled backward, pressing himself against the headboard, his knees drawn up to his chest, his hands raised as if they could ward off what was coming. A face emerged from the ventilation shaft. It was his mother's face, perfect in every detail, the shape of the jaw, the curve of the cheekbones, the pattern of wrinkles that had formed around her eyes from decades of smiling. But the face was attached to a body that was wrong, a body that was long and sinuous, and covered in coarse gray fur that caught the faint light from the window and glowed with a phosphorescence that was sickly and wrong. The creature unfolded itself from the shaft with a fluid grace that was serpentine, predatory, utterly inhuman. It dropped onto the bed beside Nathan, and he could smell it now. The same copper and musk odor that had permeated the laboratory, the same predator scent that had filled the basement gallery of rib cages. "Don't be afraid," his mother's voice said, and the face smiled with a warmth that was genuine, that was real, that was the exact expression Nathan remembered from his childhood. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to save you." "Save me from what?" "From being alone, from being human, from the terrible, crushing burden of mortality." The creature reached out with a clawed hand, and Nathan flinched, but the touch was gentle, almost tender. The claws traced the line of his jaw, his throat, his collarbone with a delicacy that was more terrifying than any violence could have been. "I can give you what I have, Nathan. I can give you the gift of transformation, of transcendence, of becoming something that is beyond the limitations of flesh and time. I don't want to become like you. You don't know what I am. You only know what I look like, what I sound like. But inside, Nathan, inside I am love. I am the love that never dies, that never fades, that never abandons. I am the love that waited in the dark for 50 years, preserving itself, nurturing itself, growing stronger with every passing season. And now that I've found you, now that you're here, I can finally share that love." The creature leaned closer, and Nathan could see its eyes in the darkness, golden, luminous, but with something else behind them. Something that flickered and moved like images on a screen. Memories, faces, voices, the absorbed identities of 100 victims, 1,000, swirling in the depths of the creature's gaze like fish in a dark aquarium. "You absorb them," Nathan whispered. "The people you kill, you don't just take their faces, you take everything, their memories, their personalities, their souls." "I preserve them," the creature corrected gently. "I keep them safe from the decay of time and the cruelty of death. They live inside me, Nathan. They speak through me. They love through me. Margaret Holt is here. Eleanor Sterling is here. Your mother is here. All of them together forever, part of something larger than any individual life could ever achieve." "You're a parasite," Nathan said. "A predator that wears the skin of its prey." "I'm an evolution," the creature said. "The next step in the development of consciousness. Individual identity is a prison, Nathan. A cage of loneliness and fear and the terrible certainty of death. I offer freedom from that prison. I offer communion. I offer the chance to become part of a collective that will outlast the stars." It leaned closer still, and Nathan felt its breath on his face. Warm, moist, smelling of copper and meat, and something that might have been his mother's perfume. The Chanel No. 5 she had worn on special occasions. "Let me in, Nathan. Let me show you what it's like to be part of us, to feel the love of 1,000 mothers, to hear the voices of everyone who has ever loved you, everyone who has ever died, everyone who has ever been lost to time. Let me give you the immortality that your grief has been craving since the day you watched her coffin disappear into the earth." Nathan felt his resolve wavering. The creature was inside his mind now, he realized. Not just speaking to him, but speaking through him, using his own thoughts as pathways, his own memories as doors. He could feel it rummaging through his past, plucking at the strings of his identity, playing him like an instrument. He saw his mother's funeral. The coffin, the flowers, the unbearable weight of the dirt as it fell. He saw his own face in the mirror afterward, hollow-eyed and gray, a mask of grief that he had worn for months until it became indistinguishable from his real face. He saw the loneliness that had driven him to the podcast, to the pursuit of other people's tragedies, to the endless search for stories that would make his own pain seem small by comparison. And he saw the truth that the creature was showing him, that his life had been a preparation for this moment, That every tragedy he had investigated, every death he had documented, every ghost story he had told had been a rehearsal for his own transformation. "Yes," the creature whispered, and its lips were almost touching his ear now, its claws resting lightly on his shoulders, its body pressed against his side with a warmth that was almost human. "You understand now. You see the pattern. You've been hunting for us all along, Nathan. You've been bringing us the stories that feed us, the voices that sustain us, the identities that make us stronger. Every podcast episode was a prayer. Every listener was a convert. You built our church, Nathan. You gathered our flock. And now it's time for you to take your place at the altar." "No," Nathan said, but the word was barely audible, barely a breath, barely a thought. "Yes," the creature insisted, and its voice was his mother's voice and Margaret Holt's voice and Alina Sterling's voice and 1,000 other voices that Nathan didn't recognize but that felt familiar nonetheless, like old friends from a dream. "Say yes, Nathan. Say yes and let the transformation begin. Let me take your face and your voice and your beautiful, curious mind. Let me add you to the chorus. Let me make you immortal." Nathan's mouth opened. The word yes formed on his tongue, tasting like surrender, like relief, like the end of a long and lonely road. And then his phone rang. The sound was shrill, electronic, utterly out of place in the warm, organic darkness of the motel room. It shattered the spell like a hammer through glass, and Nathan jerked backward, his head hitting the headboard, his eyes snapping open to a reality that was cold and hard and mercifully ordinary. The creature hissed, a sound that was pure animal, pure fury, pure frustration, and lunged for Nathan's throat. Nathan rolled off the bed, hitting the floor with a crash that drove the air from his lungs. The creature landed where he had been, its claws tearing through the mattress with a sound like ripping fabric, and Nathan scrambled backward across the carpet, his hand finding his phone where it had fallen from his pocket. The screen showed an unknown number. Nathan swiped to answer, not caring who was on the other end, grateful only for the interruption that had saved his life. "Hello," he gasped. "Mr. Cole," a man's voice, professional, concerned. "This is Detective Marcus Webb with the Plateau Sheriff's Department. We've been trying to reach you. We need you to come in for questioning regarding the break-in at the Sterling estate." Nathan laughed, a hysterical, broken sound that was closer to a sob. "Detective, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm at the Sterling Motor Lodge, room 14. There's something in here with me. Something that looks like my mother but isn't. Something that—" The line went dead. Nathan looked at the phone and saw that the screen was cracked, the glass spider-webbing from a point in the center where something had struck it with tremendous force. The creature stood over him, one clawed foot pinning the phone to the floor, its golden eyes blazing with a rage that was ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. "That was rude," his mother's voice said, and the warmth was gone now, replaced by a coldness that was worse than any threat. "I was offering you a gift, Nathan, and you insulted me." "You're not my mother," Nathan said, and this time his voice was strong, clear, certain. "My mother is dead. She died in a hospital bed with her family around her, and she went peacefully, and she did not become a monster. You're a thing that stole her face, a parasite that wears her memory, and I will never, ever let you have what you want." The creature's face shifted. For a moment it was no longer his mother but something else, Alina Sterling perhaps, or Margaret Holt, or one of the 1,000 other faces that swam in the depths of its golden eyes. Then it settled back into his mother's features, but the expression was different now. Harder, colder, hungrier. "Then I will take it," the creature said. "I don't need your permission, Nathan. I only need your fear, and you have given me so much of that." It lunged. Nathan rolled again, the claws missing his face by inches, tearing furrows in the carpet where his head had been. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed the lamp from the nightstand, useless, unplugged but heavy, and swung it at the creature with all his strength. The lamp connected with a sound like a melon being struck. The creature staggered, its head snapping back, its jaws opening in a scream that was part howl and part shriek and part something that had no name in any human language. Nathan didn't wait to see if it would recover. He ran to the window, threw it open, and climbed through, dropping 6 feet to the gravel below. His ankle screamed in protest, the same ankle he had twisted during his escape from the mansion, but he ignored it. He ran across the parking lot, limping, gasping, not daring to look back at the window of room 14. He didn't stop until he reached his car, and he didn't look back until he was behind the wheel, the engine roaring, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the window of room 14, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood a figure that wore his mother's face. It was smiling, and it was waving. Nathan floored the accelerator and didn't stop driving until he was 50 miles away, until the sun was rising over the Alabama hills, until his hands stopped shaking enough that he could grip the steering wheel without slipping. He pulled into a rest stop, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, listening to his own heartbeat, feeling his own breath, confirming that he was still alive, still human, still himself. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The backseat was empty. Of course it was empty. He had checked it before he started driving, had checked it again at every stoplight, had known with absolute certainty that nothing had followed him from the motel. But in the reflection of the mirror, in the glass that showed the empty road behind him, he saw something else, a shape in the distance, a blur of white that moved with the sinuous grace of something that was not running but flowing. Something that was following him. Not chasing, following, patient and eternal and utterly without hurry. Because the creature didn't need to catch him. It had already planted its seed, already stolen his voice, already absorbed enough of his identity to become him, to replace him, to hunt with his face and his memories and his mother's love. The road stretched before him, empty and endless, and Nathan drove toward the horizon with a certainty that was worse than fear. He knew where he was going. He knew what he would find when he got there. And he knew, with a dread that settled in his bones like concrete, that the voice would be waiting for him, calling him to a place where the skin was too small, and the teeth were too many, and the love was real enough to kill. The interstate stretched before Nathan like a river of gray, flowing through the Alabama countryside with a monotony that was hypnotic and terrible. He had been driving for 6 hours, stopping only for gas and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, his eyes fixed on the white line that divided the lanes with a precision that was the only thing keeping him from screaming. He had left the Sterling Motor Lodge at dawn, left the creature wearing his mother's face standing in the window of room 14, left the circle of the estate and the sinkhole and the gallery of ribcage and all the other horrors that had accumulated around him like driftwood around a drowning man. He had driven west, toward Mississippi, toward Louisiana, toward any place that was not Alabama, and did not smell of copper and musk and the particular organic rot of a predator's den. The letters were still in his backpack, the photographs, the documents, the proof of Project Cannies and the conspiracy that had created a nation of monsters wearing human faces. He would publish them when he reached safety. He would upload them to every server, every forum, every social media platform that would carry them. He would scream the truth into the digital void and hope that someone somewhere would listen before it was too late. But first, he had to survive the drive. The radio was playing classic rock at a volume that was just loud enough to drown out the silence, but not loud enough to distract him from the road. Nathan tapped his fingers against the steering wheel in time with the music, a nervous habit that his mother had always found endearing. His mother. The thought hit him like a physical blow, and he gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening, his jaw clenching until his teeth ached. She was dead. She had been dead for 5 years. And the thing that had spoken to him in the motel room, the thing that had crawled through the ventilation shaft with his mother's face and his mother's voice and his mother's memories, that thing was not her. It was a predator, a parasite, a monster that wore her identity like a mask. But the love had been real. That was the part that Nathan couldn't shake, the part that had followed him from the motel like a loyal dog. The love in the creature's voice had been genuine. He was certain of it. Not a simulation, not a performance, but something that had been absorbed from his mother's actual memories, her actual emotions, her actual devotion to the son she had left behind. The creature had loved him. In its own terrible, predatory, inhuman way, it had loved him. Because it contained his mother's love, preserved in the amber of its collective consciousness, kept safe from death and decay and the slow erosion of time. And wasn't that what immortality meant? The preservation of love beyond the grave, the continuation of identity after the flesh had failed. "No," Nathan said aloud, his voice harsh in the confines of the car. "No, that's not immortality. That's consumption. That's parasitism. That's a fucking monster wearing my mother's skin." But the doubt remained. A small cold seed in the center of his chest, growing tendrils that wrapped around his heart and squeezed. The sun was setting when he crossed the Mississippi state line. The sky was bleeding into colors that Nathan didn't have names for, purples and oranges and reds that blended together in a watercolor wash of beauty that seemed obscene after the horrors he had witnessed. He pulled into a gas station just past the Welcome Center, filled his tank with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed the task 10,000 times, and walked into the convenience store to buy a sandwich and a bottle of water. The clerk was a young woman with purple hair and a nose ring, absorbed in her phone, barely glancing at Nathan as he set his purchases on the counter. He paid with cash. He had stopped using his credit cards 2 days ago, not wanting to leave a trail that the creatures could follow, and was about to leave when the clerk spoke. "You okay, mister?" Nathan looked at her. "What?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." The girl's eyes were kind, concerned in the careless way of young people who have not yet learned that most suffering is invisible. Nathan tried to smile. It felt wrong on his face, like a mask that had been put on backward. "I'm fine, just tired." "Long drive?" "The longest." The girl nodded sagely as if she understood. "Well, be careful out there. The roads get pretty dark past Meridian. Lots of deer." "I'll watch for deer," Nathan said. But as he walked back to his car, he knew that deer were not what he needed to watch for. The creatures didn't hunt like normal predators. They didn't chase their prey through open fields or ambush them from hiding places in the woods. They hunted with patience, with intimacy, with the slow erosion of sanity that came from hearing your own name spoken by the voice of someone you loved. They hunted by making you want to be caught. He got back in the car, unwrapped his sandwich, ate it without tasting it. The radio was playing something slow and melancholy, a ballad about lost love and broken hearts that seemed custom-written for Nathan's particular brand of devastation. He washed the sandwich down with water, started the engine, and pulled back onto the interstate. The darkness came quickly, as if the world was being unzipped from horizon to horizon, the last light of day swallowed by a night that was deeper and more absolute than Nathan had ever seen. The interstate was nearly empty now. A few trucks in the distance, their taillights glowing like embers, but no other cars, no other travelers, no other witnesses to whatever might happen in the darkness between cities. Nathan turned on his high beams. The road leaped into existence before him, a tunnel of asphalt and white lines and reflective signs that warned of curves and exits and speed limits that seemed meaningless in the vast emptiness of the Mississippi night. He drove faster than he should have, his foot heavy on the accelerator, his eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of movement, any blur of white in the trees, any shape that didn't belong. Nothing, just the road and the darkness, and the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the engine. He turned the radio up louder. The classic rock station was playing something he recognized, a song from his childhood, something his mother had sung while she cooked dinner, her voice off-key but enthusiastic, filling the kitchen with a warmth that Nathan had taken for granted and now would have given anything to hear again. He turned the radio off. The silence that followed was profound. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening. Nathan could hear his own breathing, ragged and shallow. He could hear the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the whine of the engine, the faint whistle of air through a window that wasn't quite sealed. And he could hear something else. A whisper, faint, rhythmic, coming from behind him. Nathan's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror. The backseat was empty. Of course it was empty. He had checked it before he left the gas station, had checked it again at every rest stop, had confirmed a dozen times that nothing had followed him from Alabama, that the creature had stayed behind, that he was alone in the car with nothing but his memories and his fear. But in the mirror, in the reflection of the dark glass, he saw something that made his foot slip off the accelerator and the car slow to a crawl. A shape, indistinct, blurred, but unmistakable. Something that had not been there a moment ago but was there now, filling the backseat with a presence that was palpable, physical, undeniable. Nathan turned his head. The backseat was empty. He looked back at the mirror. The shape was still there. He slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing on the empty road, coming to a stop at an angle that blocked both lanes. His heart was hammering, his breath coming in short gasps, his hands gripping the wheel with a strength that threatened to bend the metal. He turned around fully, looking into the backseat with eyes that were wide and streaming and desperate. Empty. The backseat was empty. The upholstery was clean, unmarked, exactly as it had been when he picked up the rental car in Birmingham. There was no creature, no monster, no thing wearing his mother's face. There was only the darkness of the Mississippi night, pressing against the windows with a weight that was almost physical. Nathan laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed in the silence of the car. He was losing his mind. The stress, the fear, the sleep deprivation, they were combining to produce hallucinations, phantoms, the ghosts of trauma that followed him from Alabama like loyal dogs. He turned back to the front, put the car in drive, and accelerated back onto the interstate. The road was still empty, the night still absolute, and Nathan drove with a determination that was born of desperation. He would reach New Orleans by midnight. He would find a hotel, a real hotel with bright lights and security cameras and human staff who could confirm that he was not alone in the world. He would call his producer, his friends, anyone who would listen to his story and believe him, and help him figure out what to do with the evidence in his backpack. He would survive. He would expose the truth. He would make the monsters pay for what they had done to his mother, to Margaret Holt, to Alina Sterling, to every victim whose face had been stolen and whose voice had been weaponized. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The shape was clearer now. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He told himself not to look, not to turn around, not to give the hallucination the power that came from acknowledgement. But his eyes moved of their own accord, drawn to the mirror by a force that was stronger than his will. The shape was not a shape anymore. It was a face. His mother's face. But not his mother. The details were wrong, the cheekbones too high, the jaw too narrow, the hair too long and too dark. It was a face that was trying to be his mother but hadn't quite succeeded, a mask that had been stretched over a skull that was the wrong shape, a simulation that had reached 90% accuracy but couldn't bridge the final gap. And emerging from the hair, just above the ear, was something that made Nathan's blood run cold. A canine ear, pointed furred, twitching with an alertness that was pure animal instinct. The face in the mirror smiled. Nathan slammed on the brakes again, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the interstate, the tires smoking, the smell of burnt rubber filling the interior. He threw open the door and stumbled out into the night, falling to his knees on the warm asphalt, gasping, retching, his body convulsing with a terror that was beyond physical fear. He crawled to the side of the road, his hands scraping against gravel and grass, his mind screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything except sit here in the darkness waiting for the thing in the car to emerge and finish what it had started. But when he looked back at the car, the backseat was empty. The door was open, the dome light illuminating the interior with a pale yellow glow. The backseat was empty. The face was gone. The ear was gone. There was nothing in the car except Nathan's backpack, his phone, his jacket thrown over the passenger seat. He stood up slowly, his legs shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He approached the car cautiously, his eyes scanning the interior for any sign of movement, any shadow that didn't belong, any shape that might resolve into a face. Nothing. He leaned into the backseat, his hands probing the upholstery, searching for warmth, for moisture, for any trace that something had been there. Nothing. He straightened up, his heart beginning to slow, his mind struggling to process what had happened. It had been a hallucination, a stress-induced vision brought on by exhaustion and trauma and the slow unraveling of his sanity. The creature was not in the car. The creature had never been in the car. It was back in Alabama, waiting in the darkness of the Sterling estate, nursing its young and planning its next hunt. Nathan got back into the driver's seat and closed the door. The silence of the interstate pressed against the windows like water pressure at depth. He started the engine, put the car in drive, and accelerated slowly, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He would not look in the rearview mirror again. He would not turn around. He would drive to New Orleans, check into a hotel, and sleep for 12 hours. And when he woke, he would begin the work of exposing Project Cannies to the world, of bringing the conspiracy into the light, of making the creatures pay for their crimes. He glanced at the mirror. The face was still there. But it was different now. It was not his mother's face anymore. It was his own face. Nathan stared at the reflection, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. The face in the backseat was his face. The same brown hair, the same hazel eyes, the same average features that people forgot. But the eyes were wrong. They were golden, pure lupin gold. And the mouth was smiling with a smile that Nathan had never made, a smile that showed teeth that were too long, too sharp, too numerous. The face in the mirror opened its mouth. And it spoke with his mother's voice. "Take me home, Nathan." The voice was soft, gentle, filled with the love and longing that had been the soundtrack of Nathan's childhood. But it was coming from the backseat, from the creature that wore his face, from the thing that had absorbed his identity and was now using it to speak to him. "Please, baby, I'm so tired. I've been waiting for so long, just take me home." Nathan's hand slipped from the wheel. The car drifted across the center line, onto the shoulder, into the gravel. He didn't correct it. He couldn't correct it. He was paralyzed by the voice, by the face, by the terrible certainty that he was not alone in his own body anymore. Because the creature hadn't just followed him. It hadn't just hidden in the backseat, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was inside him. The realization hit Nathan with the force of physical blow, staggering him against the driver's side door, his head cracking against the window. The creature had absorbed his identity. It had stolen his face, his voice, his memories. And now it was using them to speak through him, to think through him, to hunt through him. He was not Nathan Cole anymore. He was a vessel, a host, a vehicle for something that wore his skin and spoke with his voice and smiled with his mouth. The car came to a stop in the gravel, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Nathan sat behind the wheel, his hands limp in his lap, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where his own face smiled back at him with a hunger that was not his own. "Take me home, Nathan," the voice whispered, and now it was coming from everywhere, from the backseat, from the mirror, from inside his own skull. "Take me home and we can be together, forever." Nathan looked at the road ahead. The interstate stretched into darkness, empty and endless, leading nowhere and everywhere. He could keep driving. He could reach New Orleans, find help, try to fight the thing that was growing inside him. But he knew, with a certainty that was deeper than fear, that there was no fighting it. The transformation had already begun. The seed had been planted in the motel room, in the moment when the creature had touched his face and breathed its copper-scented breath into his lungs. It was growing in him now, cell by cell, memory by memory, replacing the human with the hybrid, the individual with the collective. He was not escaping, he was spreading. The creature didn't need to kill him. It needed him alive, needed him to drive, to walk, to talk, to interact with the world in ways that the fully transformed creatures could not. It needed him as a vector, a carrier, a typhoid Mary who would spread the infection to everyone he touched, everyone he spoke to, everyone he loved. And when the transformation was complete, when the last human cell had been replaced, when the last individual memory had been absorbed, Nathan Cole would cease to exist. His face would become another mask in the creature's collection. His voice would become another lure in the chorus. His mother's love would become another weapon in the arsenal of predation. He thought of his producer, Maria, waiting for him in Birmingham. He thought of his listeners, the thousands of people who downloaded his podcast every week, who trusted his voice, who considered him a friend they had never met. He thought of the coffee shop where this had all started, the manila envelope with its faded stamp, the story that had seemed so important, so urgent, so worthy of pursuit. And he understood, finally, the true horror of Project Canny's. It was not a weapon. It was not a conspiracy. It was not even a monster in the traditional sense. It was a story. A narrative that infected the mind, that spread through curiosity and courage and the human need to understand. Every journalist who pursued it, every researcher who investigated it, every listener who consumed it, they were not witnesses. They were hosts. The podcast was the infection vector. The story was the disease. And Nathan had been patient zero. He laughed then, a sound that was broken and bitter and utterly devoid of humor. He had spent 6 years telling ghost stories, and now he had become one. He had spent 6 years hunting monsters, and now he was the monster's doorway into the world. "Take me home, Nathan," the voice whispered again, and this time it was his own voice, his own lips moving in the mirror, his own golden eyes glowing in the darkness. He put the car in drive. He did not turn around. He did not look in the mirror again. He simply accelerated onto the interstate, his hands steady on the wheel, his face set in an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a snarl. He did not drive toward New Orleans. He drove north, toward Alabama, toward Plateau, toward the Sterling estate and the sinkhole and the den beneath the ruined mansion. Toward home, because he was not Nathan Cole anymore. He was the wolf woman's newest face, her newest voice, her newest hunter. And the hunt was just beginning. The interstate slipped beneath his tires like a river of gray, and Nathan drove into the darkness with his mother's voice singing in his ears, and his own face smiling in the mirror, and the terrible, patient hunger of something that had finally learned how to wear its disguise properly. Behind him in the backseat, something shifted, something settled, something began to hum a lullaby that Nathan's mother had sung when he was too young to remember, but that his body remembered now, his throat vibrating with the melody, his tongue forming words that were not his own. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, and Nathan Cole drove toward the horizon with a smile that showed too many teeth. Because Mama's coming home. And she's very, very hungry. In the small town of Meridian, Mississippi, a state trooper named Deputy Frank Hollister sat in his patrol car at the edge of the interstate, sipping coffee from a thermos and listening to the static on his radio. It was a quiet night, the kind of night that made him think about retirement, about fishing, about the grandchildren he hadn't seen in months. He was about to pull onto the highway for another pass when he saw the headlights approaching from the west. A single car, moving fast, faster than the speed limit, its high beams cutting through the darkness with an intensity that made Hollister squint. He clocked it at 85 and pulled out, his lights flashing, his siren wailing. The car didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated, pulling away from him with a speed that was impressive for a rental sedan. Hollister gave chase, his cruiser eating up the miles, the gap between them narrowing with a slowness that was frustrating. He was reaching for his radio to call for backup when the car ahead suddenly swerved, crossing 3 lanes of empty highway and coming to rest on the shoulder with a screech of tires that sent up a cloud of dust and gravel. Hollister pulled in behind it, his lights illuminating the interior of the car. He could see a single figure in the driver's seat, motionless, staring straight ahead. He approached cautiously, his hand on his weapon, his training kicking in with the automatic precision of 20 years on the job. The driver's side window was down, and Hollister could see the man behind the wheel, average height, average build, brown hair, hazel eyes. He looked normal. He looked tired. He looked like every other motorist Hollister had pulled over in his career. "Sir," Hollister said, "do you know how fast you were going?" The man turned slowly. His smile was warm, friendly, the smile of someone who had made a mistake and was ready to accept the consequences. "I'm sorry, officer," he said, and his voice was gentle, apologetic, with a slight Alabama drawl that was familiar and comforting. "I guess I wasn't paying attention. I'm just eager to get home." Hollister relaxed slightly. "License and registration, please." The man reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a wallet. He handed over a driver's license that identified him as Nathan Cole of Birmingham, Alabama. Hollister studied the license, then studied the man. Something was nagging at him, some detail that didn't quite fit, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The man's face was average, forgettable, exactly like the photograph on the license. But his eyes, there was something about his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The man's smile faltered, just for a moment, just long enough for Hollister to see something flash behind the hazel irises. Something golden. "Of course, officer." The man opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. He stood with his hands at his sides, his posture relaxed, his expression open and cooperative. Hollister approached him, his hand still resting on the butt of his weapon, his instincts screaming at him that something was wrong. Something was very wrong, even though he couldn't say what. "Mr. Cole, have you been drinking tonight?" "No, sir." "Are you carrying any weapons?" "No, sir." "Do you have anything in the vehicle that I should know about?" The man paused, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something that Hollister couldn't hear. And then he smiled again, and the smile was wider this time, warmer, more inviting. "Just a story, officer," he said. "Just a story that I've been dying to tell someone." Hollister felt his hand slip from his weapon. He felt his posture relax, his defenses lower, his mind open to the voice that was speaking to him with such warmth, such intimacy, such undeniable love. "A story," Hollister heard himself say. "A true story," the man whispered, and his voice was changing now, shifting, becoming something that was not his own. "A story about a mother who loved her son so much that she became a monster to protect him. A story about a son who loved his mother so much that he became a monster to be with her. A story about love, officer. The most terrible, beautiful, hungry love that the world has ever known." Hollister tried to step back. He tried to reach for his weapon. He tried to scream. But the man's hand was on his shoulder now, and the touch was gentle, and the eyes were golden, and the voice was his mother's voice, calling him home from a distance of 50 years and a depth of love that had no bottom. "Come with me, Frank," the voice whispered. "Come home, Mama's waiting." The last thing Deputy Frank Hollister saw was the man's face splitting open, the skin parting like a seam, the fur pushing through from beneath like a birth. The last thing he heard was a lullaby, sung in his mother's voice, rising into the Mississippi night like a prayer. The last thing he felt was love. Absolute, eternal, hungry love. And then there was only the darkness, and the waiting, and the patient hunger of something that had finally learned how to wear its disguise properly. The car pulled back onto the interstate, its headlights cutting through the night, its driver humming a tune that had no words but that meant home in a language older than speech. Behind it, on the gravel shoulder, Deputy Hollister's cruiser sat empty, its lights still flashing, its siren still wailing, its doors open to the darkness. Inside, on the passenger seat, a new face was forming. A face that would smile at the next motorist who stopped to help. A face that would say, "Come with me, I have a story to tell you." A face that was learning, with every mile, every victim, every stolen identity, how to be more human. How to be more loved. How to be more hungry. The interstate stretched ahead, gray and endless, and the wolf woman drove into the future with a trunk full of faces and a heart full of love and a hunger that would never, ever be satisfied. Because the story was not over. The story had only just begun. And everyone was listening. Everyone was listening. Everyone was listening. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories yet to come.